A woman left work, got in her car, and stopped answering messages. When police got involved, they could hardly find any evidence at all. But the case quickly started snowballing with new details. And once detectives finally uncovered the full story, they could barely process what they were looking at. It was hard to believe any of this had actually happened in real life. But it did, and the case quickly captured nationwide attention. Kendra Hatcher was born on February 3, 1980, in Springfield, Illinois. She grew up in a large, deeply religious family, and from the time she was little, church was a big part of her life. In school, Kendra didn't just get top grades. She also captained 2 teams, volleyball and cheerleading. On top of that, she spent a lot of her free time helping others. She led Bible classes for kids at her church and went on mission trips instead of spending summer breaks with her friends. After finishing high school near the top of her class, Kendra went on to a university in Indiana, where she studied biochemistry and Spanish. From there, she moved to Kentucky, graduated from dental school, and became a pediatric dentist. Kendra was determined to help children, no matter how much money their parents had, so she regularly treated kids in low-income neighborhoods completely free of charge. She also traveled to Ecuador to treat kids who had no access to dental care at all. In 2015, Kendra got a job offer as a pediatric dentist at a clinic in Dallas, so she moved to Texas and rented an apartment in an upscale complex. She was 35 at the time and had already built a successful career, but she also wanted a family. A few months later, she met a 38-year-old man online named Ricardo, and things between them took off quickly. Ricky was a Harvard-trained doctor working as a dermatologist with a solid career of his own. After just a few dates, Kendra and Ricky felt like they were made for each other. On top of both being in medicine, they shared the same values, the same interests, and the same big plans for the future. Kendra was always full of energy, and Ricky matched her pace. They spent the summer of 2015 practically inseparable, traveling together whenever they could. By August, they were already talking about marriage and had even set up a joint wedding fund to save for the ceremony of their dreams. Ricky was also planning to move to California that fall, and Kendra was going to go with him. Over the next few weeks, they were busy getting ready for the move. At the same time, they planned a trip to visit Kendra's parents and also booked a short vacation in Mexico. Their flights were set for September 3rd. The day before their trip, Ricky finished his shift a little after 4 p.m., grabbed his suitcase from home, and headed over to Kendra's apartment. She was still at work, and he planned to just wait for her there. Around 6 o'clock, he went out for an evening run and got back about an hour and a half later. He hadn't taken his phone with him, and when he returned, he saw that Kendra had sent 2 texts. At about 6:45, she'd written that her shift was finally over and she was on her way home. 20 minutes later, she sent another message saying she'd decided to swing by a friend's place to borrow an underwater camera for their trip. Then, 5 minutes after Ricky got back from his run, she texted again that she was done with everything and was heading straight home. A little later, he texted her that he was starving and asked what she wanted for dinner, but she didn't reply. Figuring she just couldn't answer while driving, he wrote that he'd walk over to a nearby Mexican food truck and grab something for both of them. On his way back, Ricky noticed that the multi-level parking garage at Kendra's complex was crawling with police. Patrol cars were everywhere with their lights on, and the entrances and exits were taped off in yellow. He texted Kendra about it and told her to find somewhere else to park her car. But again, there was no response. He went back up to her apartment and waited a while longer, but Kendra still didn't come home. At that time, Ricky didn't panic at all. He assumed she might have remembered some last-minute errands before their trip and was just tied up. Eventually, he decided to drive back to his own place to grab a few more things for the road. When he returned to Kendra's building, he got into the elevator and pressed her floor, but a police officer standing inside immediately stopped him and said he couldn't go up. That's when it suddenly hit Ricky that Kendra's long silence might be connected to the police presence at her complex. And a short time later, officers confirmed his worst fear. Kendra had been found dead in the parking lot. According to officers, someone walked up to her just after she stepped out of her car and shot her in the back of the head at almost point-blank range. The killer took her purse and the underwater camera she'd just borrowed from her friend. At first, everything pointed to a robbery. Kendra lived in an upscale complex, and it was easy to imagine someone slipping into the multi-level garage hoping to mug a resident. Maybe they hadn't planned to kill her, but she screamed or tried to run. The attacker panicked and pulled the trigger. But that theory started to fall apart almost immediately. You could only get into the garage with a passcode that only residents had. And the killer didn't even take her phone, even though it was sitting in plain sight. To detectives, it began to look much more like something personal, and Ricky was the first person they took a hard look at. The fact that he'd been in her apartment and went in and out around the time of the murder made them wonder if he was involved. But surveillance footage and witness statements eventually showed he hadn't been in the garage when the shooting happened. He also seemed genuinely shocked and devastated, enough that investigators began to doubt he had anything to do with it. Soon, officers found a witness who'd been in the garage at the time of the shooting. One of the residents had gotten down there in the elevator with a friend, and as soon as the doors opened, they heard a gunshot nearby, followed by a piercing scream. The two men panicked, ran to their car, and locked themselves inside. Moments later, an old black Jeep drove past them. They immediately assumed the driver had something to do with the gunshot, because the Jeep was flying through the narrow garage at high speed, heading down as if the driver didn't realize it dead-ended below. A few seconds later, the Jeep came back up and turned the other way, toward the exit. The resident called 911 and drove outside. As he passed Kendra's car, he saw a woman's body lying next to it, in a pool of blood. Security cameras didn't cover the exact spot where the shooting happened, but detectives quickly found the black Jeep on other cameras. And that's where the first surprise came in. The driver was clearly a woman. That detail made the robbery theory look even weaker. Investigators tried to track the Jeep through its plates and registration, but got nowhere. The only thing they could say for sure was that the vehicle didn't belong to anyone who lived in the building. Detectives started talking to Kendra's friends and family, trying to figure out if she'd had any conflicts with anyone. She'd only been living in Dallas for about 6 months, so her circle there wasn't very big yet, but she had already made a few close friends. All of them said the same thing. Kendra didn't have enemies, and there hadn't been any drama in her life. At work, it was no different. Her colleagues said every parent was happy with her, and that Kendra was amazing with kids. With no real suspect to focus on, police decided to release images of the black Jeep to the media and ask the public to help identify the driver. The next day, toward evening, detectives got a call from a man named Joe. He told them the vehicle in the footage was definitely his, but he hadn't been the one driving it. According to Joe, on the day of the murder, his childhood friend, a woman named Brenda, had reached out to him. He owned an auto shop, and she asked if he could take a look at her friend's car, a woman named Crystal. Brenda and Crystal came by the shop, dropped off the car, and asked Joe if he could lend them something to drive while he worked on it. Joe handed them the keys to his black Jeep, and the two women drove off. That same evening, Joe went to a cafe where he and Brenda had agreed to meet so she could return the Jeep. But when she showed up, Crystal wasn't with her, and neither was the car. Brenda said her friend had gone off to run some errands but would be there soon. They sat in the cafe for quite a while, and the whole time, Brenda kept trying to call Crystal, but she never picked up. Then, Brenda said maybe her phone was acting up and asked to use Joe's. As soon as she dialed Crystal's number from his phone, Crystal answered right away and said she'd bring the Jeep over to Joe's house. A little later, they met there just like she'd promised. Crystal showed up with her young son, handed the car back, and she and Brenda drove off. Everything seemed normal. The next day, after Joe had already stopped thinking about the whole thing, he saw a news report about Kendra's murder and froze when he realized the police were looking for his Jeep. From the CCTV footage, it was obvious. That wasn't just the same model. It was his car. Joe met up with Brenda and told her he'd seen his Jeep on the news in connection with the killing, demanding an explanation. At first, she tried to convince him it was some other vehicle, but Joe was absolutely sure it was his. That's when she said Crystal had been the one driving and claimed she had no idea where her friend had gone or whether she had anything to do with what happened. Brenda added that Crystal regularly used drugs and that day had probably taken his Jeep to pick some up. She also told him not to contact Crystal or the police, warning it would only cause serious trouble for him. On top of that, she advised him to hide the Jeep, or better yet, repaint it. Joe knew his car had been involved in a murder and was in shock over the whole situation, so at first he didn't go to the police. He was scared he might end up in legal trouble himself. But the next day, he made up his mind and called 911. As soon as detectives got that information, they called Ricky and asked if he knew of any connection between Kendra, Brenda, and Crystal. To their surprise, Ricky said Kendra didn't know either of them, but he knew Brenda very well. She was his ex. And at that exact moment, while he was on the phone with detectives, Brenda was actually on her way over to his place. He and Brenda had met 3 years earlier, in 2012. She was 31 at the time, working as a dental assistant and studying to become a dentist herself. After a while, they moved in together and started talking about getting married. But over time, Ricky felt less and less happy in the relationship. And by August 2014, 2 years after they met, he decided to break up with her. For Brenda, it was a heavy blow. She didn't want to let him go, and even took a break from school because she couldn't think about anything except their relationship. Still, she moved out and got an apartment in a nearby neighborhood. She also kept in close contact with Ricky, and he continued to help her out, since her salary barely covered rent. Sometimes he paid for her groceries and bills, and he even added her phone line to his own plan. Ricky had no intention of getting back together with her though, and was actively trying to meet someone new. He just couldn't seem to find the right person. About 2 months after the breakup, Ricky decided to sign up for a dance class, and to his surprise, Brenda was there too. They got paired up, started talking again, and eventually, Ricky decided to give the relationship a second chance. But 6 months later, he ended up right back where he'd been before. He felt that they just weren't a good match, and this time, the breakup was final. Just like the first time, Brenda took it hard. But Ricky had no intention of getting back together and tried to keep contact to a minimum. That turned out to be easier said than done. He kept running into her all over the city. At first, he brushed it off. She lived not too far from him, so it didn't seem that strange. But after a while, it started to feel off. Wherever he went, Brenda somehow seemed to be there too. Later, Ricky met Kendra, and Brenda faded into the background for him. She was still on his phone plan though, and he'd text her every so often, asking her to switch to her own plan because he was still paying for it. Each time, Brenda talked him into waiting a little longer. Eventually, he decided to cut it off himself and messaged her that he was going to shut her line down in early September, right around the time he and Kendra were planning their trip to Mexico. Now that police had told Ricky Brenda might have been involved in the murder, he was in a panic. After Kendra's death, he told all his friends and people close to him what had happened, including Brenda. She replied only the next day, offered her condolences, and asked how she could help. She even promised to bring him groceries, and at the exact moment detectives called him, Ricky was at home waiting for her to show up. Officers quickly tracked Brenda down at a library where she was studying for an exam and brought her to the station for questioning. At the same time, detectives also located Crystal and questioned her separately. Brenda answered everything extremely carefully, as if she were afraid to give even a little more information than necessary. She said she spent several hours at the library the day before, studying for dental school exams, and then went to a cafe for about an hour. She even pulled out the receipt to prove it. Detectives realized she'd been at the cafe right during the window when Kendra was killed, which meant Brenda had a rock-solid alibi. Still, they weren't buying her story completely for a few reasons. Brenda couldn't remember the full timeline of her day, what time she'd woken up, how she'd gotten to the library or back home, or what she'd done with the rest of her time. But the cafe receipt, the one that covered the exact time of the murder, she produced instantly. It was sitting right on top inside her wallet, in almost perfect condition. Detectives got the feeling she'd been keeping it ready, knowing she might have to show it to the police. And that wasn't all. When they checked her alibi, it held up. She really had been at the cafe, and physically, she couldn't have been the one to shoot Kendra. But now that both Brenda and Crystal were at the station, detectives took another look at the security footage and realized something important. The woman behind the wheel of the Jeep looked a lot more like Crystal than Brenda. While one group of detectives was talking to Brenda, their colleagues were questioning Crystal. And that interview went a lot further. At first, Crystal insisted she didn't know anything and had nothing to do with what happened. But once they showed her the surveillance footage, she changed her story and admitted she was the one driving the Jeep. Only, she said, things hadn't happened the way the police thought. According to her, she was just driving around town with her young son when a man with a gun suddenly jumped into the car and told her to do exactly what he said. He supposedly ordered her to pull into the parking garage of an apartment building, got out of the car, and disappeared from view. A few seconds later, Crystal said she heard a gunshot. Then the man came back, got in, and told her to drive away. Detectives knew this didn't line up with reality at all. First, the surveillance footage clearly showed there was no child in the car. Second, they asked the obvious question: if this man got out and disappeared, why did you just sit there and wait instead of driving off? After that, Crystal changed her story again. This time, she said there had actually been a man with her named Lamar, and that Brenda had paid him $500 to rob Kendra and steal her documents so she wouldn't be able to fly to Mexico with Ricky. But for some reason, he decided to kill her instead. Right after that, Crystal was arrested, but Brenda's situation was more complicated. Detectives spent hours trying to get her to crack or admit to anything at all, and she kept calmly insisting she was innocent. In the end, they had to let her go. There wasn't a single piece of hard evidence tying her to the crime, and they couldn't just hold her indefinitely. As for Lamar, Crystal claimed she'd never met him before that night and had no idea how to find him. Detectives went through her phone and didn't see anyone under that name, but one contact did stand out: Christopher Love. In the days leading up to the murder, Crystal had called him several times, including shortly before and immediately after Kendra was killed. Police got his address, secured a search warrant, and found a handgun in his home that matched the caliber used in the shooting. On his phone, they also found a photo taken the day after the murder, showing him holding $500 in cash. When ballistics came back, experts confirmed it was the gun that killed Kendra. Christopher was arrested on the spot, and at first denied having anything to do with it. When detectives laid out the evidence, he admitted he'd been in the parking garage, but claimed Crystal was the one who pulled the trigger. They kept pressing, asking why, if that were true, the murder weapon was in his house and not hers. After a total of about 20 hours of questioning, he finally told them what really happened. The plan from the beginning had been to kill Kendra. Brenda was behind it, Crystal was the driver, and he was the one who fired the shot. With two people now pointing the finger at Brenda, detectives finally had enough to arrest her. But they were in for a nasty surprise. They found out she'd fled to Mexico, and no one seemed to know exactly where she was hiding. The FBI put her on their list of most wanted women, and Mexican authorities joined the hunt. Even so, Brenda managed to stay off the radar for months. It wasn't until about half a year later that police finally found her lying low at a relative's house. She barely went outside and spoke only to family, which is why it took so long to track her down. Catching her, however, created a new problem for the U.S. prosecutor. He fully intended to seek the death penalty, but Mexico would only agree to extradite her if the United States promised not to pursue a death sentence. That left him with two options: walk away and let Brenda live her life in Mexico, or give up the death penalty and go for life in prison instead. It wasn't a hard choice. He agreed to drop the death penalty, and Brenda was extradited back to the United States. By the time Brenda was back in the U.S., a lot had changed. Detectives had spent months building the case, and the pile of evidence they'd put together painted a genuinely disturbing picture. Crystal, who'd been sitting in jail this whole time, agreed to a plea deal: 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. In exchange, she started talking. She said she was broke and desperate, so when Brenda offered her $500 to help with the plan, she agreed. As for Christopher, Brenda told him she had powerful connections to a major cartel, and that if he helped her get rid of Kendra, there would be big money and a huge supply of drugs waiting for him. According to Crystal, Brenda was completely obsessed with Ricky. After he broke up with her, she couldn't think about anything else and spent almost all her time tracking him. she'd gotten access to his iCloud, which meant she could basically see everything he did on his phone. On top of that, she got into his email and even added his phone to a Find My iPhone app so she could see his location at any time. That's why Ricky kept bumping into her all over town. Brenda knew exactly where he was, almost every minute of the day. She also read all of his messages, including the ones with Kendra, and she could see their relationship moving fast. Watching Ricky fall in love with someone else was something she just couldn't accept. About 6 months before the murder, Brenda started putting together a plan to get rid of Ricky's new girlfriend and walk away without police ever looking in her direction. At one point, she tried to talk one of her friends into helping. The idea was to inject Kendra with a concentrated dose of some kind of drug and hit Ricky in the head hard enough to put him in a coma. Brenda was furious that he'd chosen someone else, but she still didn't want him dead, just out of the picture. That friend later told police she'd actually considered it for a while because Brenda offered her $2,000 and drugs, but in the end, she backed out. Later, through that same woman, Brenda met her friend Crystal and quickly earned her trust. Over the next few months, Brenda talked about almost nothing but Ricky and his new girlfriend. She saved every photo of them from social media, studied the routes of their trips, and read all of their messages. From there, the conversations turned darker. The two women started discussing how they could get rid of Kendra, and Brenda kept throwing out ideas, from poisoning her to staging some kind of tragic accident. Then, they decided they needed a third person, someone who would actually pull the trigger. So they went walking around Crystal's neighborhood, which was known for being pretty rough, and that's where they ran into a local drug dealer named Christopher. He quickly agreed to take the job in exchange for cash and drugs, and even said he already had a gun. After that, they spent a long time following Kendra, learning her routes inside and out. Eventually, Brenda decided the best place to kill her would be the multi-level parking garage at Kendra's building. They started sneaking in by tailing residents' cars as they drove through the gate, using their entry code. They memorized where Kendra usually parked and even talked about putting a tracker on her car in case she picked a different spot. Finally, they chose a day and set the plan in motion. Brenda went to one friend and asked to borrow his car, saying hers had broken down. He agreed, and Crystal and Christopher set out to do the job. But they quickly realized the car had some kind of mechanical issue and got spooked that it might ruin everything. Brenda returned that car to her friend and then turned to someone else, Joe, the same Joe who later came forward to the police. He lent her his black Jeep. Crystal got behind the wheel, Christopher hid in the back seat, and Brenda got out near the library so she'd have an alibi. Crystal and Christopher drove over to the clinic where Kendra worked and waited for her to head home. But she was running late, which wasn't part of the plan. Eventually, Crystal left the area, dropped Christopher off near her neighborhood, picked up her son from school, took him to her parents' place, then came back for Christopher, and together they returned to Kendra's clinic. Before that, they'd put fake plates on the Jeep so it couldn't be traced. When Kendra finally pulled out of the parking lot, they followed her, but quickly lost her car in traffic. So they headed straight to her building instead, waited for a resident to drive into the garage, and slipped in right behind them. Once inside, they found a spot to hide and lay in wait for Kendra. While they were waiting, Christopher wiped down the gun in every single round, then put on gloves. As soon as Kendra drove into the garage, parked in her usual spot, and stepped out of her car, Christopher ran up to her and fired a single shot at almost point-blank range. After that, he jumped back into the Jeep and Crystal tried to get out of the garage. At first, she accidentally drove down, thinking there was an exit there, only to hit a dead end. She turned around, made it out, and headed to a nearby town, where they wanted to get rid of Kendra's purse. Christopher had taken it so the whole thing would look like a robbery, another one of Brenda's ideas. When they got back to Dallas, they waited for Brenda's call. At that moment, she was sitting in a cafe with Joe, pretending she was trying to reach Crystal, but in reality, she was just stalling for time. Eventually, she dialed Crystal's number from Joe's phone, and her friend confirmed the job was done. After that, they returned the Jeep to its owner, then drove to Crystal's parents' house and burned Kendra's things in the backyard. It turned out they'd gone to that other town for nothing, failing to find a good place to dump the evidence. Afterward, Brenda paid them and said that if the police ever got close, she planned to run to Mexico. And while she was still off the detective's radar, she didn't miss the chance to comfort Ricky. She brought him groceries and acted like she was just a caring friend, looking after him in the middle of his grief. In the end, prosecutors had more than enough evidence on all three people involved, and the case moved to trial. First up was Christopher. In 2018, for his role in the murder, he was sentenced to death. Next came Crystal. She received the agreed-upon sentence from her plea deal, 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. And finally, in the summer of 2019, it was Brenda's turn, the woman who had put the whole plan together. Prosecutors told the jury she was driven by jealousy and an obsession on a truly terrifying scale, and that if it weren't for the conditions of her extradition from Mexico, she almost certainly would have been given the death penalty. The jury needed just 20 minutes to reach a verdict, an incredibly short time in a case like this. Brenda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, she showed no sign of remorse and never apologized to Kendra's family, though they didn't expect her to. Right now, all three are still behind bars. In February 2025, there was talk that a judge might finally set an execution date for Christopher, but so far that hasn't happened. So, this complicated case eventually came to a close, but it left a permanent mark on everyone involved because of how senselessly cruel it was. Even if you set aside the fact that Brenda was willing to have another woman killed simply because she'd fallen in love with her ex, there are still Christopher and Crystal, people who agreed to help carry out that plan for a few $100s with zero regard for someone else's life. Crystal Grimsmud was born on November 24, 1980, in Boulder, Colorado. She grew up in a big, loving family and fell in love with dance early on, constantly performing in different shows. She was also drawn to science and graduated high school with top marks. Because of that, Crystal earned a scholarship to one of the most prestigious colleges in the country, where she started studying biochemical engineering. A little later, she transferred to the University of Colorado and finished her degree there in the same field. After graduating, she got a job at a local company that developed scientific equipment and software. It was a pretty competitive position with a very high bar to get in, and Crystal was hired largely because of her outstanding academic record. She quickly proved herself to be a key employee, and over the next few years, her career kept moving steadily upward. Around that time, she met a man named Daniel Krug, a data analyst at the State Department of Public Health and Environment. In 2007, the two got married, and over the next few years, they had 2 daughters and a son. From then on, Crystal and Daniel focused on raising their kids and lived a pretty quiet, steady life, until everything suddenly changed in 2023. In early October, when she was 42, Crystal woke up like any other morning, getting ready to send the kids off to school, when something on her phone caught her eye. It was a message from a man named Anthony, someone she dated in college 23 years earlier. They'd been together for about a year before breaking up, and since then, they'd barely stayed in touch. It already seemed strange that Anthony was reaching out after more than 2 decades, but what really threw her was the content of the message. He wrote, "Hi Crystal, it's Anthony. Hope it's okay I looked you up. I'm in Boulder every few weeks and thought we could hook up. You game?" Crystal found the whole thing really odd. It was obvious Anthony was just trying to set up something physical with no strings attached, and she had zero interest in that, so she decided not to respond at all. The next day, he messaged again, and this time the tone was completely different. He went straight into insults, cutting out the profanity. It was basically, "Are you there? You should say yes when I offer a pity F. Whatever. I saw your pics. You got fat. Bet your loser husband won't F your fat C. Don't waste my time." Crystal couldn't understand why he was talking to her like this. Since their breakup, they'd only spoken a few times over the years, and those brief conversations had never been flirty. Just quick check-ins about life before they drifted out of touch again. About 5 years earlier, he'd messaged her out of nowhere and tried to reminisce about the relationship. But Crystal told him she was happily married with 3 kids and wasn't interested in any kind of fling. After that, he blocked her on social media, and they hadn't spoken since. Now, he was back, acting completely unhinged. Crystal found herself wondering what had happened to him in all those years they'd been out of contact. But despite the nasty things he'd said, she decided not to escalate anything and simply ignored his message again. For a while after that, Anthony went quiet, and Crystal started to hope he'd finally left her alone. But almost a month later, a third message came in, and this one terrified her. Anthony sent a photo of her husband getting out of his car in front of the building where he worked. From his clothes, Crystal could tell the picture had been taken that very day, which meant Anthony hadn't just figured out where her husband worked, he'd gone there and watched him. Along with the photo, Anthony started insulting her husband and added that he should drive more carefully because something on his car might end up getting damaged. So now, this wasn't just name-calling anymore. It was a direct threat. Crystal was scared he might actually hurt her family, so she decided she had to go to the police. On Halloween, she filed a report, explaining everything that had been happening and attaching all of Anthony's messages, along with a photo. She also made it clear that she had never given him her phone number, email address, or any other personal contact information. The only way they'd ever communicated was through social media, and none of that data was listed on her profile. Police took the report, and 2 days later, a detective was assigned to the case. While he was still getting up to speed, Anthony sent another message. This time, he wrote that her license plates were expired, and she should really get them renewed. He added that he'd also checked her husband's car, and his plates were still fine. Crystal, who genuinely hadn't realized her plates were out of date, now knew for sure that Anthony had her home address and was actively watching her. Not long after that, he sent her a photo of genitals and another semi-nude picture. Then other men started messaging her, saying they'd found her number on a hookup site. That's when Crystal realized Anthony had started posting her number on adult websites. Over the next few days, Crystal was living in constant fear, and what terrified her most was the thought that Anthony might somehow go after her children, who were 14, 11, and 8. Before long, the detective asked her to come down to the station, and she sat with him and went through everything that had happened, telling him how scared she was for her family's safety. He promised to look into it, and Crystal waited to hear what he would find out. About a week after Anthony first reached out, she went to a dentist appointment. When she walked out of the office and checked her phone, there was another message from him. This time, Anthony wrote that he'd been watching her during the appointment from his car, and that he'd performed a sexual act on her vehicle. Crystal drove straight to the detective and showed him the message. She pointed out that no one knew she had the dentist appointment, which meant Anthony literally had to be following her around town and tracking her every move. The detective told her he'd uncovered a few important details. Anthony wasn't using a normal phone number. He was messaging her through an app that assigns users random phone numbers, which makes them hard to trace. On top of that, the detective found out that Anthony did have a personal Verizon cell number, but he never used it to contact Crystal. He stuck to the anonymous texting service. In other words, he'd set things up so it would be difficult for police to prove he was the one behind the harassment. After leaving the station, Crystal went straight home and locked herself inside until her husband returned. She was too afraid to drive anywhere, knowing Anthony could be nearby at any moment. After the day at the dentist, Anthony suddenly went quiet again, and over the next couple of weeks, Crystal started to think he might finally have backed off. But on November 12th, about 6 weeks after the very first message, he reached out again. This time, he went back to pushing her for something sexual and wrote that he was willing to get rid of her husband because he didn't satisfy her and she was supposed to be with Anthony instead. He added that the security at her husband's workplace was terrible and that he'd been able to walk into the building without anyone stopping him. Crystal was panicking. At the moment she read that message, her husband was actually at work, so she called the police right away. Officers went to Daniel's office, checked the building, and didn't find Anthony anywhere. They also couldn't confirm that he'd ever been inside. But on one point, he wasn't lying. The building's security was extremely lax, so it was entirely possible he could have slipped in unnoticed. A little while later, he messaged again and said he was still waiting for her approval to take care of her husband. Meanwhile, the official investigation wasn't going anywhere fast. The detective found out Anthony moved constantly, which made it hard to pin down a current address. The only solid information he could get was 2 previous addresses in other states, one in Idaho and one in Utah. He also tried to get a warrant for account records tied to the messages Anthony was sending, But someone at the police department messed up the paperwork, and the judge denied the request. They had to start the whole process over, and since the case wasn't classified as an immediate life or death emergency, getting that warrant could take weeks. In the end, Crystal and her husband basically had to start doing their own legwork. They dug up everything they could find about Anthony in open sources, old addresses, phone numbers, anything, and handed it all to the police. Daniel also hired a private investigator and installed security cameras around their home in case Anthony ever showed up there. Even with all that, the police kept working the case at a slow, cautious pace. They didn't even try to contact Anthony directly, saying they didn't yet have enough to confront him. All of this took a serious toll on Crystal. She was afraid to leave the house, jumped at every phone call and notification, and more than anything, she was terrified that Anthony might shift his focus to her kids. And through all of this, the messages kept coming. They weren't as openly threatening as before, but he still made it very clear he was watching them, commenting on where she'd been and sending more photos of her husband taken in different parts of town. This went on until December 14th, 2023. 2.5 months after Anthony first reached out, Crystal's husband called police and said she hadn't answered his calls or texts for 3 hours. He was at work in a neighboring city, and Crystal should have already been home after meeting with the detective to hear about any progress in the case. With everything going on with Anthony, Daniel immediately started to panic, but he couldn't get back quickly enough to check on her himself, so he called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. Detective Martinez, who was handling the case, was alarmed right away. He didn't have any meetings scheduled with Crystal that day, and she hadn't reached out to him at all. Officers started to wonder if she'd discovered something new or was planning to bring them important information, headed to the station, and for some reason, never made it there. They drove out to the house, but no one came to the door. The officers walked around the property several times, peeking through every window they could, but saw no movement inside. At that point, Daniel was already driving home from work, and the kids were still at school. While they were waiting for him to arrive, the officers decided to check the small garage windows up near the ceiling. The main windows were covered with curtains, so they couldn't see in. But they pulled the patrol car right up next to the garage, climbed onto it, and looked through the high windows. As soon as they did, they saw a woman lying motionless on the garage floor in a pool of blood. They called for an ambulance and forced the front door, then rushed into the garage. They immediately recognized Crystal. She had no pulse, but her body was still warm. Paramedics tried to resuscitate her, but there was nothing they could do. From the very beginning, detectives could see they were dealing with a homicide. Crystal's body showed obvious stab wounds, and there was a blood stain on the wall next to her. Her body was sent to the medical examiner while officers started working the scene. First, they confirmed there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. When police arrived, every door and window was closed. Another strange detail stood out right away. The front door security camera that Crystal and her husband had installed just a few weeks earlier had been covered with duct tape. Around the house, there were 3 more cameras, but all of them had been switched off right around the time of the murder, so detectives couldn't pull any useful footage. Afterward, all 3 cameras came back online as normal, which led police to believe the killer had managed to disable them only for the window of time needed to commit the crime. Crystal's body was lying at the bottom of the stairs leading from the house down into the garage. Her purse and car keys were on the floor next to her. It looked like she'd been about to go somewhere when the attack happened. Detectives also noticed something else. Inside her purse was a handgun that she and her husband had bought after all the harassment and threats from Anthony had started. For some reason, Crystal never even got the chance to pull it out, which raised a major question. Whoever attacked her had to get into the house without leaving any trace of a break-in and hit her so suddenly that she didn't have time to react. One theory was that the killer had gotten hold of a spare key and hidden it in the garage, waiting for Crystal to come down the stairs to leave. The medical examiner later found that Crystal had been struck twice in the head with a blunt object and had a stab wound to her side. All of this fit the idea that she'd been taken completely off guard. It looked like the killer had hit her before she could even reach for the gun, leaving her no chance to defend herself. From the very first hours of the investigation, detectives were convinced this had to lead back to Anthony, the man who'd been stalking Crystal for months. Now that the case had been reclassified as a homicide, they quickly got a warrant for his arrest and began searching for him. Before long, they learned he might be living in the neighboring state of Utah, and reached out to local police to check the address on file. Officers went to that house, and sure enough, Anthony was there. They started asking questions, but he acted like he had no idea what they were talking about. When they asked when he'd last been in contact with Crystal, he told them it was 2014, 9 years earlier. He insisted he hadn't spoken to her since and absolutely had not been stalking her. Detectives hadn't really expected him to confess on the spot, but things quickly started to get strange. Utah officers had shown up at Anthony's home just a few hours after Crystal was killed, and he was calmly sitting in his living room. The problem was, the drive from his house to Crystal's town was about 8 hours. Investigators checked whether he could have pulled it off by flying back instead, but found no record of him on any flight, and even by plane, the timing would have been extremely tight, if not impossible. On top of that, around the time Crystal was murdered, Anthony was at a store with his wife, buying a sweater. That was backed up by solid evidence, so detectives suddenly found themselves asking a disturbing question. Was it possible that Anthony had sent all those messages but had nothing to do with the actual killing? Anthony stuck to his story. He said he hadn't messaged Crystal in years, and even let police go through his smartphone without a warrant. Given that the stalker had used anonymous apps with different numbers, detectives didn't really expect to find a neat, obvious trail on his phone anyway. They considered the possibility of a second phone or a laptop being used, but Anthony told them they could check all his devices, and they still didn't find anything useful. Digging deeper, investigators eventually concluded that Anthony had been in Utah the entire time, including during moments when the stalker was telling Crystal he was watching her. So not only did detectives fail to link Anthony to the murder, they'd practically proven he was unlikely to be involved at all. Unless, of course, he'd somehow pulled off a plan so intricate the police simply weren't capable of untangling it. Looking for answers, investigators finally got the warrants they needed and brought in the department's tech unit. Digital forensic experts started digging into the stalker's messages, his accounts, the photos he'd sent, and every bit of data they could pull. Before long, they tracked down an IP address and discovered that the messages were being sent over Wi-Fi from a specific location. But it wasn't in Utah, where Anthony lived. It was inside the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the exact building where Daniel, Crystal's husband, worked. Detectives, who had not been expecting that twist at all, started digging even deeper. The tech team told them all the messages had come from a so-called burner phone, and when police traced the purchase, they found it had been paid for with a gift card. Store records showed that the card had been issued in Daniel's name. After that, detectives went back to Crystal's friends and family, and they added even more context. It turned out that before the stalking ever began, Crystal and Daniel's marriage was already falling apart. She had told people close to her more than once that she was planning to file for divorce and that she couldn't stand living with him anymore. Her mother also mentioned that Daniel could be rough with the kids and even hit them. Because of that, Crystal was planning to seek full custody and use photos of their bruises to make sure he'd never be able to hurt them again. By then, Crystal and Daniel had been living in separate rooms for quite a while and had basically split their finances. But once the messages from Anthony started, her focus shifted almost entirely to dealing with the stalker, and the divorce plans were pushed to the back burner. Once they had all of that in hand, police asked Daniel to come back into the station. This time, they started carefully feeling him out, without putting all their cards on the table at once. At first, the detectives walked him through where the investigation stood and mentioned that Anthony had a rock-solid alibi, at least for the time of the murder. Daniel said he had no idea who, other than Anthony, would want to hurt his wife, and added that now he was afraid for himself and his children, because the real killer was still out there. That's when the detective slowly shifted the conversation to what the tech team had found and told him that the stalker's messages had been sent from Daniel's work Wi-Fi. Daniel immediately offered an explanation for that. According to him, Anthony had come by his workplace, taken photos, and even gone inside the building more than once. Everyone there used the same Wi-Fi password, and the login and password were posted outside each office, so Anthony could have easily seen them while walking through the department. But the detective told him that still didn't really add up, and then laid out a different theory, one very carefully worded so it didn't directly accuse Daniel of murder, but nudged him toward admitting that he'd been the one behind the stalking. The detective suggested that, with the marriage falling apart, Daniel might have come up with a plan to keep Crystal from leaving, and at the same time test whether she'd be interested in another man. So, he started messaging her as her ex, trying to pull her into something sexual, and when that didn't work, he escalated to threats so she'd feel genuinely unsafe. All the while, Daniel was ramping up security at home, hiring a private investigator, and playing the role of protector, hoping Crystal would decide she needed him and shouldn't walk away and face this danger alone. The detective was hoping Daniel would at least admit to being the fake Anthony, which would make it much easier to link him to the murder later. But Daniel kept insisting he had nothing to do with any of it. With nothing concrete to hold him on, they had to let him go and kept looking for more evidence. They confirmed that only 2 people had the passwords to access the home security cameras, Crystal and Daniel. In a previous interview, the detectives had asked Daniel why the cameras suddenly went offline around the time of the murder, and he hadn't been able to give any kind of clear explanation. They also learned that on the day of the killing, Daniel showed up to work about half an hour later than usual, which, in theory, gave him enough time to commit the murder and get rid of evidence. Since Crystal's body was found around noon, that meant she must have been lying there for several hours before he called police. Daniel, for his part, said the reason he was late was nothing more than diarrhea. According to him, he'd just spent that extra half hour in the bathroom. Sometime later, Crystal's mother shared something else that bothered her. She'd been staying at the house full-time, helping with the kids, and in the very first days after the murder, she noticed Daniel was already throwing out Crystal's clothes and other personal things. He also told her he planned to sell the house as soon as possible. On top of that, he didn't seem grief-stricken or even particularly upset. Instead, he was mostly irritated that the police were looking at him and kept complaining that they were trying to set him up. All of that was still just circumstantial and hard to rely on. But soon, detectives got something much stronger. Over several days, they collected footage from all the home security cameras up and down Crystal's street. After watching hundreds of hours from different angles, they were confident that not a single unfamiliar person or vehicle had approached the house that morning. With the way all those cameras overlapped, it was basically impossible. In other words, if someone else had killed her, that person would have had to show up on at least one of the neighbors' systems. Since no one did, police were left with only 2 options. Either Daniel, who was already in the house, committed the murder, or the killer somehow materialized in the garage and then vanished off the street without being seen. Detectives also pointed out that there were no signs of forced entry and no evidence of a struggle inside. Even though the marriage was in trouble, Crystal simply didn't believe her husband would try to kill her, which is likely why she never even reached for the gun in her bag. Eventually, detectives put together a full picture of what they believed Daniel had done. In their view, he hadn't set out to kill his wife at first. He started stalking her under Anthony's name to scare her out of filing for divorce and keep her in the marriage. Maybe he thought she'd be too afraid to move out and take the kids away from their father, terrified that Anthony might target them. Or maybe his plan was to make Crystal see how much he cared about her and her children by stepping in as the protector. On top of that, detectives believed he was deliberately sending threats about himself from Anthony and taking those creepy surveillance-style photos so Crystal would start worrying about her husband, hoping that fear would rekindle whatever feelings were left. But then, they say, things started to spiral. Crystal was far more terrified than Daniel had planned. She started digging into Anthony's background, looking for information, and staying in constant contact with police. Daniel realized that if this kept going, his entire lie could be exposed. And if that happened, he could be facing real criminal charges. In that scenario, he might lose custody of the kids, his reputation, his job, essentially everything. Backed into a corner of his own making, Daniel, according to detectives, decided to kill her, telling himself there was no other way out. He hoped the police would pin everything on Anthony while he stayed free with the kids, the house, and the money. On the morning of the murder, he stayed home longer on purpose, waiting until the kids left for school, and then followed Crystal into the garage as she was getting ready to go out. There, he allegedly caught her off guard and hit her in the head several times with a heavy object, hard enough to knock her unconscious. After that, Daniel took a knife, stabbed her once in the side of the chest, and then drove to work, getting rid of the weapon and any other evidence along the way. On December 16th, 2 days after the murder, police arrested Daniel on 3 counts: first-degree murder, stalking, and impersonating another person. He pleaded not guilty and hired an attorney, and preparation for trial began. It started in April 2025, and by then investigators had even more evidence tying him to the crime. On the day of the murder alone, Daniel had been Googling things like, when does a head injury become a reason for concern? How hard do you have to hit someone in the head to knock them out? And how long can someone be unconscious without brain damage? On top of that, an ex-girlfriend from his high school and college years reached out to police. Their relationship had ended more than 20 years earlier, but what she described fit Daniel's pattern disturbingly well. She said that after they broke up, she started getting messages from different people claiming to be various friends and acquaintances of Daniel. They all sent her threats and told her breaking up with him was a huge mistake. Eventually, she figured out that none of these real people had actually written anything. It was Daniel sending all the messages himself, pretending to be them. She was scared he might act on those threats, so she went to the police and got a restraining order against him. After that, the messages stopped. The defense leaned hard on the fact that police never found the murder weapon, and there wasn't a trace of blood in Daniel's car or on his clothes. But none of that was enough to convince the jury he was innocent, and in the end, they found him guilty. For the murder, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus another 9.5 years on the other 2 counts. And with that, the twisted case came to an end. Because of Daniel's actions, his 3 children effectively lost both parents. They're now living with Crystal's brother and his wife, while other relatives help raise them and try to give them something close to a normal life. Andrea Kincada was born on May 10, 1946, in Washington, D.C. After finishing high school, she enrolled at George Washington University, and not long after graduating, she met a man named Howard. They got married and had a son, but later divorced. Andrea and her son moved to Arlington, just outside D.C., where she took a job at a library and quickly fell in love with it. Andrea adored reading and learning new things, so she was happy to be there, often picking up extra shifts and barely taking a day off. She also loved staying active, and every morning before work, she'd swim laps at the pool. In 1988, when she was 42, Andrea met a man named James, and the two started dating. He was 26 at the time, but the age gap never seemed to bother them. 3 years later, they got engaged and moved in together, renting an apartment in a small complex in a nice neighborhood. On top of that, they bought some land outside the city and started building their dream home, doing the work themselves, putting real time and heart into the project. Over the next few years, the couple settled into a quiet routine, planning their wedding and still working on their dream house. James worked as a geologist for engineering firms and picked up extra hours at a building supply store, while Andrea stayed at the library. Her son, who'd been living with them the whole time, eventually moved out, and the two of them were on their own. In 1998, Andrea was 52, and she and James had been together for about 10 years. On August 21st, she was finally looking forward to a rare day off. She was usually always working, but this time she had the whole day planned: lunch with a friend, and then a date night with James. Either they'd go to the movies or rent something and just stay in. That morning, Andrea did her usual swim, stopped by work briefly, and was back home by around 11 a.m. She emailed her friend to confirm she'd be at the restaurant at 1 p.m., but she never showed. Her friend tried calling the house phone, but there was no answer. So she figured Andrea got held up, or maybe her plans had changed. Around 6 p.m., James came home from work, and Andrea wasn't there. Her car was gone too, so he assumed she was still out, either at the restaurant with her friend or running an errand. He waited for hours, but she never came back. And close to midnight, he finally fell asleep. When he woke up around 1:30 a.m., she still wasn't home. Lying there in bed, he noticed something that immediately felt off. The closet door in their bedroom, the one that was always left wide open, was now almost closed. The door was broken and didn't really shut all the way, so they always kept it fully open. James said this was the first time he'd ever seen it nearly closed. He got up and looked toward the closet, but it was too dark to see inside. So he turned on the light, and that's when he found her. Andrea's body was on the closet floor, tucked up against the wall, and James knew right away she was dead. James called 911, and paramedics responded to the apartment. They confirmed Andrea had been dead for at least several hours. Her body was taken for examination, and detectives opened an investigation. First, they talked to James. He told them he'd gotten home around 6 p.m., ate dinner, took a shower, and did some laundry. He said he never opened the closet door at any point, so he had no idea Andrea had been in the apartment the entire time. In other words, he'd been living just a few feet away from her body for roughly 7 hours before he found her. James also said several items were missing from the apartment, including Andrea's purse, her car keys, a green bag, and a few stacks of coins he'd been collecting. What didn't make sense was what the killer didn't take. There was cash sitting out in plain sight, plus other valuables, including an expensive watch still on Andrea's wrist. Later, James also noticed something else was gone. His mother's will had disappeared from a file drawer. When crime scene techs started processing the apartment, they were thrown by how little they were finding. It looked like the place had been thoroughly cleaned, to the point they couldn't even tell where the attack happened. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, and no clear traces left behind. Detectives also found no signs of forced entry, although James said that when he came home from work, the apartment door wasn't locked. In total, techs lifted around 600 fingerprints from all over the apartment. Almost all of them belonged to James, but none matched Andrea. And that was bizarre, considering she lived there for 7 years. Even stranger, the closet door handle where her body was found had no prints at all, like someone had wiped it down on purpose. Same with the vacuum cleaner that had clearly been used after the killing. It was spotless. Not long after, the medical examiner finished the autopsy and ruled that Andrea died by strangulation. They also noted a few small bruises on her hands and other parts of her body, suggesting she'd fought back. But there were no major injuries, no signs of sexual assault, and no foreign DNA, which was yet another dead end for investigators. The one detail that really caught their attention was a small mark on Andrea's thigh. It was a triangle-shaped impression with a curved line running through it. With everything they had, detectives started leaning toward a personal motive, because robbery didn't fit, and neither did anything sexual. Their first suspect was James, and for a few different reasons. Detectives immediately started questioning James' story after they listened to his 911 call. He'd supposedly just found the body of his fiancée, the woman he'd been with for nearly 10 years. Yet he sounded completely calm, like he was ordering a pizza.
Arlington 911, what is your emergency?
I need an officer at 17.
What's going on?
I thought my girlfriend was missing.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't seen her. We were supposed to go out tonight.
Mm-hmm.
But I figured I'd give her some time. I think she's dead.
You think so?
Yeah, in
Right.
the closet. The door was closed.
On top of that, they couldn't get past one detail. He'd spent a full 7 hours in the apartment with her body there, and somehow never noticed a thing. And then, in the middle of the night, he claimed he suddenly spotted that the broken closet door was almost closed, in a dark room, and only then did he find Andrea. Police brought him in for an interview, and for hours, he walked them through his entire evening, step by step. He said that when he got home from work, The front door wasn't locked, and Andrea wasn't inside. But for some reason, that didn't seem to alarm him much. He took a shower, and then he noticed there were several messages on the answering machine in the bedroom, the one sitting right next to the same closet. James said that while he was listening to them, standing just a few feet from the slightly closed closet door, he also noticed something else. The bedroom carpet looked unusually clean, like someone had just vacuumed it, and he insisted it wasn't him. He said he hadn't cleaned the apartment, and that Andrea usually did the cleaning on weekends, not on a weekday. As for the messages, the first one was from Andrea's friend, the one who'd been waiting for her at the restaurant. She called to check if she was okay and asked why she'd missed their plans. The next 3 messages were from James himself. He'd been calling home from work, but nobody ever picked up. And the last message came from another friend of Andrea's. A relative of hers had ended up in the hospital, and Andrea had been helping by watching her kids while the family dealt with everything. The friend said she had bad news and asked Andrea to call her back as soon as she could. James told detectives that in that moment, he assumed Andrea must have heard that last message and driven over to that friend. But then he also admitted something that didn't quite make sense. He said all 5 messages were still marked as unheard. After a while, he tried calling that friend back, hoping Andrea might be at her place, but no one answered. After that, James said he cleaned out his car, grabbed the trash bags from the apartment, and took them out to the dumpster near the complex. Then he did laundry, hung everything up to dry, and sat down to watch TV. Later that night, he went to bed in the bedroom with the closet, the same closet where Andrea was later found, and fell asleep. A few hours later, he woke up and, while still lying in bed, noticed the closet door looked more closed than usual. He got up, walked over, and that's when he discovered her body. Detectives also pointed out that the laundry baskets James had been using were sitting right next to the closet, meaning he'd been right up against that area multiple times that evening, close enough that it was hard to believe he wouldn't have noticed anything. James also told them that at one point he couldn't find his keys and carefully searched the entire bedroom, but he still insisted he never saw his fiance's body. And there was another detail that stood out. A detective asked why, when he called 911, he did it from the second bedroom, the one that used to belong to Andrea's son, instead of calling from his own room. James said there was an old rotary phone in the master bedroom that he wasn't used to anymore, so he went to the other room to use a more familiar push-button phone. In total, police spent dozens of hours interviewing James, but he kept insisting he was innocent. After one of those interviews, he called detectives and said he'd stumbled across Andrea's car while driving home. It was parked on the shoulder across the river from Arlington. Forensics found the clutch had been burned out, so the car couldn't be driven. And on top of that, they couldn't recover a single usable fingerprint or DNA sample. It looked like someone had thoroughly wiped the car down before dumping it there. Not long after, investigators uncovered another detail that seemed to point back to James. Remember that odd triangular mark on Andrea's thigh? Analysts compared it to the shoes James had been wearing that night and said the tread pattern on his sneakers was a match. They also noted the imprint could have been left if Andrea's skin was wet, like she'd been attacked shortly after getting out of the shower. Still, even with all of those circumstantial signs, detectives ran into a major problem. The medical examiners estimated Andrea was killed around 1 p.m., while James didn't get home from work until about 6. Police dug into his alibi, interviewed his coworkers, and concluded he simply couldn't have been back at the apartment earlier that afternoon, meaning he wouldn't have had the chance to do it. And motive was another issue. Everyone close to them described Andrea and James as happy. No obvious tension, no big fights, nothing that screamed, "This was coming." Still, detectives did learn something new. In one of his later interviews, James admitted he spent a lot of time on adult websites with paid live streams, and that he'd poured a fair amount of money into them. He also said he'd started talking to one of the women who worked there, though it never went beyond emails. Even so, he kept insisting he had nothing to do with Andrea's murder, and police still couldn't actually tie him to it. So, with no other real leads, they decided to try a different tactic. They brought him in again and told him the medical examiner had now nailed down the exact time of death, and that Andrea had been killed after James got home. They also claimed they'd found his fingerprint on her body. None of that was true, but detectives are allowed to bluff like that to try to shake something loose. And they left out one key detail on purpose. They didn't tell James how Andrea died, because they were hoping he'd slip and reveal it himself. James still denied killing her, but before long, his story started to shift. Carefully choosing his words, he said that if his prints had supposedly been found on her body, then maybe he'd moved her into the closet for some reason, even though he claimed he had absolutely no memory of doing that. He kept saying he couldn't remember anything different from his original version of events, and eventually, detectives asked him to walk through how the night could have gone, hypothetically, if he had killed Andrea. James kept insisting he had zero memory of killing her, but then he started talking anyway. He said that day they could have gotten into a fight because Andrea found out how much money he'd been spending on those adult livestream sites. Then he suggested he might have hit her a few times and that Andrea fell to the floor, and when he reached down to check her pulse, he realized she was dead. But even in this so-called confession, James never once mentioned the actual cause of death, strangulation. That basically killed the detective's hopes of using his story in court, because his version didn't match the evidence. Still, the interview wasn't a total waste. Once James admitted the livestream obsession, detectives started digging into his behavior off the internet, and what they found wasn't great. They spoke to a woman who lived in the same complex. She told them that both that year and the year before, James had left her flowers on Valentine's Day. He'd also show up with cookies sometimes, and when Andrea was out of town with her son, James even came by with a movie on VHS. The neighbor also said he'd been watching her, popping up in places she went, like it wasn't a coincidence. And one time, someone even spotted him outside her apartment windows, looking in. On top of that, detectives learned James had gone on at least one date with another woman, something Andrea apparently didn't know about. So yeah, it definitely put a dent in the picture of this perfect relationship. But without a real confession, and with his alibi still holding up, police were basically stuck. As a result, detectives had to shift their focus away from James and start looking at other possibilities. After talking to Andrea's relatives and friends, they learned that none of them believed James was involved. Everyone described him as calm and non-confrontational, and even Andrea's son insisted police were wasting time on an innocent man. In fact, her son, along with several of Andrea's friends, said they believed they knew who the real killer was, and they pushed police to investigate him. According to them, a few weeks before Andrea died, she was getting ready to throw out her old computer. Around that same time, a maintenance company was doing some work in their apartment complex, and Andrea asked one of the workers whether they took old computers for recycling. He told her no, but said he'd gladly take it for personal use. Andrea handed it over, and even gave him her home phone number so he could reach her if he ran into any issues logging in or accessing the account. What shocked her loved ones most was what they learned next. Andrea had actually let the man into the apartment to pick up the computer, and she even walked him into the bedroom, where it was kept. That's why Andrea's family and friends believed this worker could have been the one who killed her. He'd been inside her home, knew the layout, and could have easily gotten back in later, just by knocking on the door and coming up with some excuse about the computer. After police hit a dead end with James, they finally tracked down this man, a worker named Bobby, and they quickly realized he might be their guy. Just days after Andrea was murdered, Bobby was arrested for attacking his ex-wife. And that was only the start. He had a long criminal history, including sexual assaults, beatings, and other violent offenses. Detectives went to the jail to interview him, but he denied having anything to do with Andrea's murder. He also agreed to give a DNA sample and fingerprints. But the problem was, investigators basically had nothing solid to compare them to, so the case stalled again. About a year later, Bobby was arrested all over again. This time, he attacked a woman, started choking her, sexually assaulted her, and dragged her into a closet. He thought he'd killed her, but she survived, and she was able to identify him. Bobby was sentenced to life in prison, and Andrea's investigators couldn't ignore how eerily similar that assault was to what happened in Andrea's apartment. But they still had one major problem. There was no physical evidence tying Bobby to Andrea's case. Because of that, the case hit another wall, and for years, police couldn't make any real progress. At one point, Andrea's family hired a private investigator, and she came to the same conclusion they had. Bobby was the most likely killer. And instead of building a case against him, detectives had spent years going after James with nothing solid to back it up. And what made it even stranger was this. Despite all the red flags around Bobby, investigators officially crossed him off the suspect list. To Andrea's family, that made no sense, but there was nothing they could do. Over the years that followed, detectives still treated James as their main suspect, but he kept insisting again and again that he had nothing to do with Andrea's death. In 2013, 15 years after Andrea was killed, the case was handed over to the Cold Case Unit. The new detectives went back through everything from scratch, and at first it didn't lead anywhere. Still, unlike the investigators before them, they weren't in a hurry to rule out Bobby. His record and the way he'd attacked other victims made it hard to ignore him. By then, he was already serving life, with basically no chance of ever getting out. And in 2018, after years of hitting dead ends, detectives decided to try a different angle. They offered him a deal. If Bobby finally told the truth, the prosecutor wouldn't seek the death penalty. And since he wasn't going home either way, extra time didn't really mean anything to him. He agreed, so detectives went to sit down and talk to him. 20 years after Andrea was killed, Bobby finally admitted he was the one who did it. He said that day he drove to her apartment complex and knocked on her door, using the computer she'd given him a few weeks earlier as an excuse. Andrea opened up. They talked for a bit in the hallway, and at some point, Bobby asked for something to drink. She said she'd grab him a soda, and the second she turned away, he lunged at her and started choking her. Bobby claimed she barely fought back, and once he was sure she was dead, he dragged her body into the closet. But that was just the beginning of his story, because then he laid out what he said was the motive. A couple days after Andrea handed him the computer, Bobby called her with a few questions. Andrea told him she didn't really know the technical stuff and handed the phone to a man Bobby described as either her husband or her boyfriend. The guy walked him through the settings. They hung up, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, Bobby said the man called him back a few days later. But this time, it wasn't about the computer. He started asking personal questions about Bobby's life, his family, details that had nothing to do with anything. Bobby thought it was weird, but he answered anyway. Then, the calls kept coming, and on one of them, the man made it clear he knew a lot about Bobby, his criminal history, the times he'd been locked up, the cases he'd been involved in. When Bobby asked how he knew all that, the man supposedly said he was an engineer and he knew how to find information. According to Bobby, that's when the man started hinting he had work for him, staying vague for hours before finally saying what he wanted. Bobby claimed the man offered him $5,000 to kill Andrea, quietly, without using a gun. He said the money would be waiting in a boot inside the bedroom closet. Bobby said the man even told him exactly when Andrea would be home, around 1 p.m. So Bobby agreed, showed up at that time, used the computer story to get her to open the door, and asked for a drink so she'd turn her back. Then he followed her inside, killed her, ran a bath to check if she was still breathing, dragged her into the closet, and started looking for the promised cash. But when he searched the closet, the money wasn't there. Bobby said he tore through both closets in the apartment, checking every boot and digging through jacket pockets, but the money was nowhere to be found. That's when he noticed a large vase packed with coins, so he grabbed that instead, stuffed it into a gym bag, and figured he'd take the victim's car too, because the bag was too heavy. But he didn't get far. He burned out the clutch on the way, so he abandoned the car on the side of the road, after wiping it down to get rid of his fingerprints. Back home, he counted the coins and said it came up to roughly $650. He was furious. He claimed he wanted to kill Andrea's boyfriend, the guy who'd set him up and promised him $5,000. But he never got the chance, because not long after that, he was arrested for assaulting his ex-wife. So Bobby gave detectives a huge amount of detail, but there was one major problem. The man who allegedly hired him never gave a name, and Bobby never met him face to face. From the detective's perspective, if Bobby was telling the truth, the mystery caller pretty much had to be James. There just weren't many other realistic options. And it didn't help that James often described himself as an engineer because he worked for engineering firms, even though his actual role was lower level. But that kind of logic didn't survive in court, and that was a brutal setback for the investigation. Still, detectives felt they were in the home stretch, and they started thinking about how they could actually prove James was involved. According to Bobby, he didn't bother cleaning up at all. He said there was water everywhere from the bathtub. The closets were trashed from him digging for the money, and the soda can he drank from was just left on the floor. But when police showed up after James's 911 call, the apartment was basically spotless. James had told investigators that after he got home from work, he took out some trash, but he insisted he never vacuumed or cleaned the place. Later, detectives showed Bobby the crime scene photos from that night, and he confirmed it. When he left, it looked nothing like that, meaning someone had come in after him and cleaned up. After detectives got all of that, they started thinking about how they could actually tie James to it, and instead of confronting him directly, they tried a pretty unusual move. Undercover officers approached him on the street, claimed they were Bobby's relatives, and demanded the $5,000 James supposedly owed him from back in 1998. The idea was to get him to slip up on tape, but it went nowhere. James refused to admit he owed anyone money, and pretty quickly, he said he wanted his lawyer, like he was starting to suspect these relatives were really connected to police. Not long after that, Andrea's son, Chris, made his own attempt to catch James. By then, the two of them barely spoke, and James had a new family. Chris hadn't believed James could have done it at first, but over the years, he started leaning more and more in that direction. So he wanted to help detectives prove it. On the 20th anniversary of Andrea's murder, Chris invited James to dinner and secretly recorded the whole conversation. First, he asked why James had given police that false confession in the early months of the investigation. James said detectives had kept him awake through endless interviews, and his brain basically stopped working. Under that kind of pressure, he started convincing himself he must have done it. Later in the conversation, Chris asked whether James had vacuumed the apartment that night, and James said yes. That directly contradicted what he told police before, when he swore he never even touched the vacuum. Chris also felt like the motive was obvious. James had been spending a lot of money on adult livestream sites, and he'd been seeing other women on the side. Chris believed his mom may have found out, and if she left him, James would have had to move out. On top of that, he could have lost his stake in the unfinished house they were building out of town, or been forced to pay a large amount to buy Andrea's share. In the end, detectives were left with two possible scenarios. Either James pulled off something close to a perfect crime, hiring someone to kill his fiancée and leaving no clear trail back to him, or James became an accomplice without even realizing it, by cleaning the apartment and wiping out evidence against Bobby, all while somehow not noticing Andrea's body in the closet. Even with a shaky case, the prosecutors decided to lean on Bobby's testimony, and in 2021, James was arrested. The trial started 2 years later, and his defense attorney immediately went after the investigators' early mistakes. He pointed out that police never even tried to track down the trash James said he took out that night. As for the vacuum bag, it sat untouched for nearly 2 decades. They only tested it right before trial, and by then, experts couldn't pull anything useful from it. According to the defense, Bobby really did commit the murder, but a lot of his story was either exaggerated or flat out made up. The attorney argued that Bobby may have been offered a perk, like a transfer to a better facility, if he gave testimony against James, especially since detectives had been locked onto James for years. And he kept coming back to one big question. If Bobby was supposedly furious about not getting that promised $5,000, why wait 20 years to point the finger? Bobby was already facing life in prison. If revenge was the goal, he could have gone to police way earlier and tried to bury James back then. The defense also pointed out that Bobby had committed similar attacks before, including an attempted murder, and he did all of that on his own, not because someone was paying him. The prosecution pushed back by arguing that Bobby's other crimes had a clear sexual motive, while in Andrea's case, he killed her without any obvious reason or payoff. They also brought up another key detail. By the time Bobby confessed to Andrea's murder, he was already waiting on a transfer to a more comfortable prison. But once these new charges came up, that transfer was canceled, so he didn't gain anything from confessing. If anything, he lost his shot at getting moved. James's attorney responded that investigators could have simply played Bobby, promising him a transfer, hinting they can make it happen, and making it sound like they could pull strings, so Bobby might have believed them. As for Bobby himself, he insisted he confessed for a different reason. He'd found religion, and he felt like a voice inside him was telling him to come clean. When it came to James's possible motive, the defense said the money angle didn't hold up either. Chris had suspected James might be afraid of losing the country house, but at trial, it came out that James alone owned the land the house was on, meaning a breakup wouldn't have forced him to pay Andrea anything. In the end, the prosecution played the recording of James's interrogation, the one where he confessed, but it honestly backfired. The jurors heard detectives practically dragging a confession out of him, flat out lying about what evidence they supposedly had. And they also heard that James's description of how Andrea died didn't match reality at all. When the trial wrapped up, the jury took less than an hour to come back with a verdict. They found him not guilty, and James was released right there in the courtroom. Later, one juror said they couldn't understand how police had even built a case against him. There just wasn't any solid evidence. After the acquittal, James sued one of the detectives, claiming she misled the jury. According to him, she told them Bobby had named James directly, even though in reality, Bobby said the person who hired him never once gave a name. But eventually, that lawsuit was dismissed. As for Bobby, even before James's trial began, he'd already been handed a second life sentence for Andrea's murder. Not that it changed much for him personally, because he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars either way. Andrea's son was devastated by the not guilty verdict, and he never stopped believing James was involved in her murder. So, in a legal sense, this tangled case is basically over. There's almost no chance James will ever be tried again. Under the law, he walked away an innocent man. But to this day, plenty of people are still convinced he played a direct role, and that he essentially got away with the perfect crime. Christine Holloway was born on October 31st, 1976, in Connecticut. She was the oldest of 5 kids, so from a young age, she helped her parents take care of her younger brothers and sisters. That experience shaped what she wanted to do with her life. She knew she wanted to work with children. After earning a psychology degree in college, she got a job as a preschool teacher in Bridgeport. Christine had this natural way with kids, and she quickly became someone the daycare couldn't do without. Her coworkers said she had endless patience and always put the children first, even if it meant staying late and going the extra mile. Outside of work, Christine was deeply involved in her church and spent a lot of time helping with different charity programs. For years, she kept doing what she loved, but there was one thing missing. Christine spent her days caring for other people's children, and she dreamed of having a child of her own. She just hadn't found the right partner. It stayed that way until 2016, when she met a man named Jose, and they started dating. In September 2018, when Christine was 42, they had a daughter, Vanessa. Christine was over the moon, and from that point on, she poured herself into raising her little girl, all while continuing to work at the daycare. The following year, toward the end of November, Christine, Jose, and Vanessa spent Thanksgiving at Jose's parents' house, then went back home. 3 days later, on December 2nd, Christine was supposed to come in for her shift at the daycare, but she never showed up. Her supervisor immediately felt something was off because Christine was never late. If anything, she was usually early, coming in ahead of time to get everything ready. And she always brought Vanessa with her, so the little girl was normally there all day too. At first, her supervisor figured maybe Christine got held up by snow or traffic. It was a Monday morning right after a major holiday, and the roads could be a mess. But as more time passed and Christine still didn't appear, she tried calling her. No answer. That's when the worry really set in. The supervisor reached out to Christine's family, and they said they hadn't heard from her in days. After they tried calling her themselves and got nothing, they decided to contact police and asked officers to go to her home for a welfare check, since her relatives lived in a neighboring town. Around 1 p.m., officers arrived at the address. Christine lived in a small, multi-unit house, basically one building split into separate apartments. They saw her car parked out front, but when they knocked, nobody answered. And right away, they noticed something that felt off. Even though it was below freezing, a few of the windows in her unit were cracked open. It was suspicious, but the officers didn't feel they had enough to force their way inside, so they left. Back at the station, they called Jose to ask if he knew where Christine and the baby were. Jose told them he'd seen them around 7 a.m. when Christine left for work with Vanessa, and that she hadn't contacted him since. Not long after that, Christine's brother came to the station. By then, the whole family was in full panic mode. No one had heard from her for hours, and they were starting to believe something was seriously wrong. With Christine's brother there, officers called Jose again, and this time, Jose suddenly changed his story. Earlier, he'd said he saw Christine that morning. Now, he claimed he actually wasn't home, and that he'd only spoken to her on the phone around 7 a.m. He also told police Christine drove a gold 2002 Mazda, but her family said that was outdated. Just a week earlier, Christine had bought a black 2017 Ford Focus, and they said Christine had told them Jose helped her pick it out and even went with her to the dealership. Then, officers asked him a simple question. The black Ford parked outside Christine's place. Who did it belong to? Jose said he didn't know. All of it sounded extremely suspicious, so officers went back to Christine's place and started knocking on neighbors' doors. No one had seen Christine that day, but one neighbor did mention something that immediately raised alarms. He said he'd seen Jose coming out of her apartment that morning. With everything they had at that point, officers decided they couldn't wait any longer. No one had been able to reach Christine for more than 10 hours, and her daughter was missing too, so they forced the door open. Inside, the lights were on, but the apartment was empty. The living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, nothing looked out of place. But as soon as one officer stepped into the bathroom, he started screaming. There was a woman's body in the bathtub with obvious injuries, and officers immediately called in backup. The medical examiner determined she'd been killed by 8 severe blows to the head, most likely with something heavy like a hammer. She was also completely unclothed, and it looked like her body had been dragged into the bathroom after the attack. As for the timeline, the examiner estimated she died sometime between Saturday night and early Sunday morning, more than a full day before she was found. In Christine's hand, investigators also found a clump of hair, something she likely ripped out of her attacker during the struggle. Forensics quickly concluded the attack happened in the living room and that Christine's body was moved into the bathroom afterward. But at first glance, there was almost no blood and no obvious signs of a struggle anywhere in the apartment. When they looked closer, the reason became clear. Someone had thoroughly cleaned the place. Blood had been scrubbed off the floors, the walls, and other surfaces. When investigators took apart the drain under the kitchen sink, they pulled out small bone fragments that appeared to be human. And under that same sink, they found a trash can filled with empty beer cans, even though Christine didn't drink. Detectives quickly confirmed the victim was Christine, but Vanessa was nowhere to be found. Inside the apartment, they found one little flip-flop that clearly belonged to her, but the matching one was missing, and they realized a lot of the baby's things were gone too. The car seat, a white baby blanket, and a bag with her other stuff with Vanessa's favorite teething ring. That actually gave detectives a small bit of hope. It suggested whoever took Vanessa might have been planning to keep caring for her, not hurt her. And when they tested every blood sample they could find, all of it came back to Christine. none of it matched Vanessa. While crime scene techs worked the apartment, detectives started talking to neighbors. One man, who used a first-floor garage as a workshop, said he'd been down there Friday evening around 5 p.m. He told police he'd heard a loud banging from the unit above, a man's voice yelling, and sounds like someone was dragging or moving furniture. Another neighbor said that on Saturday morning he saw Jose outside the house, loading a car seat with a small child into a black Ford. A third neighbor told investigators he saw Jose leaving Christine's apartment on Monday afternoon, not long after police had first come by. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from outside the building and spotted Jose's vehicle driving away. After that, detectives started pulling camera footage from nearby streets, hoping to track movements in and out of the area. At the same time, their focus tightened on Jose, because between his behavior and what neighbors were saying, the picture was starting to look really bad. Officers went to the home of Jose's mother and stepfather where he was living and brought him in for questioning. At that point, detectives still hadn't told Christine's family what they'd found inside the apartment. So officially, Christine and Vanessa were still being treated as missing. During the 40-minute ride to the station, Jose stayed oddly calm. He even commented on how nice the patrol car was, and he never once asked how the search for his daughter was going. In the interview room, he started saying he wasn't especially close to Christine or their daughter. He said he'd visit them on weekends, but during the week he lived with his parents. He also mentioned he had 2 kids from a previous marriage who sometimes came to stay with him. Then, Jose started insisting he didn't do drugs and barely drank, even though no one had asked him. When detectives asked when he last saw Christine and Vanessa, he said it was Friday night. According to him, after Thanksgiving at his parents' house, everyone went their separate ways. Jose claimed he went to see a friend named Hector and spent most of the weekend with him in a nearby city, but he struggled to give police Hector's last name or even his address. One of the detectives also pointed out the obvious. Jose didn't seem even remotely worried about his missing girlfriend and daughter. Jose insisted he was worried and said he'd even tried calling Christine a few times, but claimed there wasn't much else he could do. About 40 minutes into the interview, he said he wanted to leave. Before letting him go, detectives asked if he'd hand over his clothes for DNA testing, and Jose agreed. When he took off his shirt, officers noticed several fresh bruises and scratches on his body. Jose claimed he had no idea where they came from. They also saw scrapes on his knuckles, the kind that can show up when someone's been throwing punches. But what really caught their attention was his clothes. Detectives spotted stains that looked like blood, along with something that looked like bits of skin, though they'd need lab testing to confirm what it actually was. And since they couldn't arrest him yet, they had to drive him back home. So detectives used the moment to their advantage. They went inside with him and started talking to Jose's mother and stepfather. Once all 3 of them were in the same room, one of the detectives finally mentioned for the first time that Christine had been killed. Jose's mother immediately broke down, screaming, crying, while Jose didn't show any obvious emotion at all. When she demanded to know what happened, detectives told her they were actually hoping her son would explain that, because he wasn't giving them anything. That's when Jose's mother turned on him and started pushing him to answer their questions. The detectives brought up Christine's car. Like we said earlier, Jose had first claimed she drove an older vehicle and acted like he didn't even know about the newer Ford. Now, with his mother right there, he suddenly backtracked. He claimed police had misunderstood him. He did know Christine had a new car, he said. He just didn't know where it was now. His mother kept asking him directly what happened to Christine, and Jose just repeated over and over that he didn't know. But to the detectives, it didn't even look like his own mother believed him. Then she told detectives something else. On Friday night, Jose left their house at the same time as Christine, but in separate cars. Christine drove off in the new black Ford, and Jose left in his own vehicle. When police later reviewed surveillance footage from different cameras, they confirmed that for at least part of the route, Jose was driving behind Christine, though they couldn't piece together the entire trip. Jose still insisted he went to see his friend and didn't see Christine all weekend, but his mother immediately corrected him. She said she'd FaceTimed him over the weekend, and during that call, Jose was clearly inside Christine's apartment. Jose tried to explain it away by saying he'd used his friend's phone, then quickly switched it and said he'd actually called her from his iPad. But even then, he kept insisting he was at his friend's place, not at Christine's. despite what his own mother had just told detectives. Detectives told Jose's mother they already had surveillance footage and witnesses placing him around Christine's home on Saturday and Sunday. That pushed things over the edge. Jose's mother basically started interrogating him alongside the police, demanding he finally say where he really was over the weekend. And on Monday morning too, when a neighbor spotted him again. Jose froze up and couldn't give a straight answer. One detective pointed out that he wasn't exactly rushing to help them here, and Jose tried to brush it off by saying basically, "With this kind of pressure, I can't think," and that he wasn't exactly the most clear-minded person in general. After a beat, he snapped and started yelling at his mom. Jose insisted he'd FaceTimed her from Hector's place, but he pretended he was at Christine's because he didn't want his mom knowing he was hanging out with a friend instead of being with family. While that was going on, other investigators were working on a warrant, and the second it was signed, they seized Jose's iPad. Sure enough, it showed an outgoing FaceTime call to his mother, and forensic techs confirmed that at the time of the call, the iPad was connected to Christine's apartment Wi-Fi. But it didn't stop there. When detectives pulled Jose's phone records, they found he'd called 911 at around 2 a.m. on Saturday, and at that moment, his phone was pinging off a tower near Christine's place. They listened to the call, and the voice sounded like Jose. He sounded drunk, slurring, barely getting words out. He gave the operator the street where Christine lived, but he didn't give a house number, and he never explained why he was calling. Then, in the background, detectives heard a woman's voice say, "Stop, who are you calling? Hang up." Police believed that was Christine, which would mean she was still alive at that point. That night, dispatch did send a patrol car to the street, and officers drove through the area, but they didn't see anything that stood out. And the evidence kept stacking up. After taking the iPad, police also searched Jose's parents' house. In his bathroom, they found towels and rags with what looked like bloodstains. In the trunk of his car, there was a black plastic bag with blood inside. Later testing confirmed the blood belonged to Christine. Her blood was also found inside the car itself, including on the pedals. Soon, detectives tracked down Jose's friend, Hector. At first, he backed up Jose's story and claimed Jose really had been with him the entire weekend, but later, he changed his statement. He admitted Jose had asked him to lie, and in reality, Jose kept taking off and was gone for most of the weekend. Forensic teams also finished combing through hundreds of hours of surveillance footage. They found that around 6 a.m. on Saturday, Jose's car left the street where Christine lived. He stopped at a gas station and tried to buy cigarettes, but his debit card was declined. Later that same day, he was seen leaving Christine's place in her black Ford, and where he went after that is still unclear. What stood out even more was this. During that time, Christine's phone was moving around the city right alongside Jose's phone, even though investigators believe she was already dead. Detectives also noted that by Monday morning, both Jose's car and Christine's car were parked outside her place again, right up until the moment officers first showed up, something that's visible on body cam footage. Based on the timeline, they believed that while police were knocking at the door, Jose was likely inside the apartment. Not long after, police got a call that helped connect another dot in Jose's timeline. It came from staff at a local church, in the same direction Jose had been driving repeatedly that weekend. They had donation bins out front, and on December 5th, employees started sorting through the items left inside. That's when they found a bag stuffed with blood-covered items, children's clothes, toys, women's clothing, and even letters addressed to Christine. One of the staff members Googled her name, saw the active investigation, and immediately called the police. Investigators took the donated clothes and toys into evidence. Mixed in with the children's stuff, they also found men's t-shirts and button-downs, the same size Jose wore. And there was something else too. A child's flip-flop in the same brand as the single sandal police had already found inside Christine's home. Lab testing later confirmed that every blood sample on those items belonged to Christine. None of it matched Vanessa's DNA. As for the missing car seat, the blanket, the bag, and Vanessa's teething ring, none of those items were found. So police had no concrete reason to believe the little girl had been harmed, but her whereabouts were still completely unknown. The FBI quickly joined the search, offered a $10,000 reward for Vanessa's safe return, and even promised immunity to anyone who brought her back alive and unharmed. Meanwhile, the evidence against Jose had piled up to the point that detectives finally had enough to arrest him and charge him with murder. When it came to Vanessa, Jose still insisted he had no idea where she was, but after hours of questioning, his story started shifting. At one point, he claimed that over the weekend, he and Hector had been using powerful drugs, the kind that can cause hallucinations and leave you disoriented. Because of that, he barely remembered what happened. According to Jose, his memory was only coming back little by little. He then admitted he actually was at Christine's apartment late Friday into Saturday. And this is where his story got even stranger. Jose said 2 unknown men burst in, pinned him to the floor, and attacked Christine. He claimed he couldn't fight back because he was high and barely conscious. But then he started giving police oddly specific details, like he remembered every step. He said the men hit him and he blacked out, but then he also claimed that while he was down on the floor, he saw one of them carry Vanessa out. Jose said Christine tried to stop him, and that's when she was killed. He described their movements almost minute by minute, all while insisting he was basically unconscious. Before they left, he claimed one of the men warned him, call the police, and they'd hurt his daughter. Jose said he fell asleep after that and didn't wake up until morning. He claimed he barely remembered the night before, started searching for Vanessa, and realized she was gone. Then he saw Christine's body and said he wanted to call 911, but panicked because of the threat. And then comes the part that made detectives completely skeptical. Instead of calling for help, Jose claimed he cleaned up. He said he dragged Christine into the bathroom, stripped her, washed her clothes and hung them up to dry, then grabbed a bucket and rags and started scrubbing the living room. After that, he said he bagged up the bloody items and dumped them in a donation bin. Over the next few days, he just kept going and eventually returned to his parents' house like nothing had happened. Of course, investigators didn't buy his story for a second. They found no evidence that Jose was on any kind of hallucinogens. If anything, they thought he'd simply been drunk, especially with all the empty beer cans they found in the trash. And if he really had been on those drugs, detectives said there's no way he could have cleaned the apartment and then driven around town afterward. People on stuff like that can barely walk straight, let alone scrub floors and run errands in a car. On top of that, detectives learned Jose and Christine's relationship had been in a mess for a long time, and he'd been acting increasingly aggressive for months. Once police got access to their messages, they saw a pattern. Jose constantly insulted her, got jealous, and tried to control her each step. Just a few weeks before the murder, he even demanded she cancel her gym membership because he was convinced she might meet other men there. And despite all of that, Christine still kept trying to make it work, mostly because she wanted Jose in their daughter's life. She'd text him that she was willing to fix things, to work on their issues, and he'd respond with insults or just tell her to get lost. Then, detectives uncovered another piece of the puzzle Christine never knew about. Jose had a serious criminal history. As a teenager, he'd been arrested more than a dozen times. As an adult, he'd been picked up for drug dealing, assaults, robberies, the list went on. Investigators also flagged multiple incidents involving violence against previous girlfriends, including at least one case where he allegedly threatened to kill a woman. By this point, prosecutors felt they had everything they needed to take the case to trial. In their view, Jose was volatile, aggressive, jealous, and prone to violence, with a history of alcohol and drug issues on top of that. And judging by the way he spoke to Christine in his messages, there was a real hatred there. Prosecutors believed he could have snapped and killed her in a rage, fueled by alcohol. As for Jose's story about 2 mystery attackers, detectives didn't find a shred of support for it. They reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage across the neighborhood and never spotted a single unknown vehicle that could have belonged to those men. And inside the home, there were no foreign DNA samples either. The one thing that still didn't make sense was Vanessa. The baby was gone, and so were key items you'd need to care for her. Because of that, investigators leaned toward one theory. Jose may have handed her off to someone he knew, someone willing to hide her or get her out of town. But despite a major search effort, that lead went nowhere. Jose never confessed, and without solid evidence, prosecutors couldn't charge him with kidnapping. There was also one more odd detail: Jose's movements before he finally went back to his parents' place. His parents lived in New Haven, and Christine lived in Ansonia, but phone location data showed he didn't take a direct route. Instead, he made a wide loop north through a wooded area. Detectives suspected he may have dumped evidence out there, especially since the murder weapon was never found. In the end, Jose was headed to trial only for Christine's murder, and the lead-up dragged on for more than 5 years. The case didn't finally go to court until the spring of 2025, and he stuck to the exact same story the whole time. 2 unknown men did it. The defense leaned hard on one key point. Police didn't have a single piece of evidence that tied their client directly to the killing itself, only to what came after, the cleanup. And they also pushed another detail. As you remember, investigators found a clump of hair in Christine's hand, like she'd ripped it out during a struggle, and DNA testing showed it belonged to Jose. But there was something else too. Under her fingernails, they found another biological sample that didn't match him, and to this day, no one has ever identified whose it was. As for that strange 911 call, Jose claimed he dialed because he saw unknown men approaching Christine's place. But because he was high, he couldn't even get the address out. And the line Christine said on the recording, he explained that away too. According to him, she hadn't seen those men yet, so she didn't understand why he was calling police in the first place. Jose took the stand and walked the jury through his version of events in extreme detail. But the more he talked, the less they seemed to buy it. The prosecution's timeline just held together better. And in the end, the jury only needed 2 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. Guilty. On July 14, 2025, Jose was sentenced to 65 years in prison. His attorneys immediately filed an appeal, and as of now, there's still no final decision. But even with Jose most likely behind bars for the rest of his life, the case still didn't feel over because Vanessa was still missing. The FBI kept looking for her all those years. They repeatedly put her case back out there, released age-progressed images showing what Vanessa might look like today, and even offered full immunity to whomever may be hiding her. But so far, none of it has led to answers. Christine's family believes Vanessa is still alive, raised by someone Jose handed her off to after the murder. They don't rule out the possibility she was taken out of the country. But even if she was nearby, recognizing her after so many years would be incredibly difficult. And they're still holding on to one hope, that one day Jose finally tells the truth about where she is. Maybe someday he'll be offered a deal, the chance to get out in old age in exchange for that information. But for now, he's staying silent and waiting on his appeal. Jesse Morrison was born on July 25, 1995, in the small town of Greenville, Tennessee. She grew up in a big family. Her parents had 4 daughters, and because of that, Jessie always dreamed of building a big family of her own one day. Not long after finishing high school, she started dating a guy named William, and they had a son together. But the relationship didn't last. A while later, Jessie got into a relationship with a man named Gary, and she had another little boy. Then, about a year after that, when she was 21, she got pregnant again, and she and Gary got engaged, planning to get married soon. By late summer 2016, Jessie was living with her fiancé in a small town called Afton, about 6 miles from Greenville. She was 16 weeks pregnant at the time, and pretty much all her time and energy went into taking care of her 2 boys. On August 12th, Jessie's fiancé was expecting her back home, but as the evening dragged on, she never showed. Gary tried calling, but she didn't answer. He called her mom next, and she couldn't reach her either. And since Jessie had left earlier with her 2 little boys, who were just 3 and 1, it didn't take long for everyone to feel that something was seriously off. Then they learned something even stranger. That morning, Jessie had dropped the kids off at their grandmother's and never came back for them. They waited a little longer, hoping she'd turn up. But as night got closer and Jessie still hadn't contacted anyone, they finally went to the police. When her mom and fiancé got to the station, officers told them Jessie had been missing for less than a day, and it was too soon to open a missing person case. But not long after that, detectives noticed something. Just a few hours earlier, another call had come in, one that might be connected to Jessie. Around 7:30 that evening, a local man was walking his dog along a quiet back road about 9 miles outside of Afton. As he passed a small creek, he noticed something strange between the trees, and within seconds, he realized it was a human body. He ran back home to call police, and officers rushed to the area. The moment they saw the body, they knew it was a homicide. The victim had clear signs of violent injuries, so her body was sent to the medical examiner for a full examination. But the scene itself didn't give them much to work with. It looked like the killing had happened somewhere else, and the body had been dumped on that isolated road afterward. There were no personal items nearby, which made identification even harder. A few hours later, Jessie's family showed up at the police station to report her missing, and detectives soon connected the dots. Jessie's mother pulled up photos of her tattoos, and the medical examiner confirmed the same tattoos on the body. Later, investigators determined Jessie had died from multiple devastating blows to the head, likely from something like a crowbar. And the amount of scrapes and scratches on her body suggested she'd fought back really hard. So detectives officially opened a homicide investigation and sent officers to search the area where the body had been found. A few miles away, they started finding Jessie's belongings scattered along the roadside, almost like someone had been tossing them out as they drove. First, they came across paperwork from her older son's hospital visit. Further down the road, they found a child's medical wristband, pieces of Jessie's driver's license, part of her phone case, a box of cereal, and a pack of cigarettes. Then, at another spot, officers recovered a pair of shorts, a diaper, and even more documents connected to the hospital visit. It didn't feel random at all. To detectives, it looked like someone had been tossing her belongings along the route to that remote spot, either before or after they dumped the body, trying to get rid of evidence. And the fact that her license had been cut into pieces made it feel like someone was trying to slow down identification and buy time. At the same time, detectives were interviewing Jessie's family to rebuild her last known movements. They said the last time they'd seen her was the day before everything happened, when Jessie's younger sister stopped by the house. Jessie was there with her kids and her fiancé, Gary, and they mostly talked about a small dental procedure Jessie's older son was scheduled to have the next morning. Her sister expected Jessie to call afterward and tell her how it went, but that call never came. Late that morning, Jessie did text her mother while she was still at the hospital. They'd already agreed her mom would stay over that night to help with the kids while her son recovered. But after that one message, Jessie went completely silent. Hour by hour, her family got more and more worried. By evening, they started searching on their own. Around 7:30 p.m., Jessie's sister and father drove to her house, but Jessie and the boys weren't there. They were met by Gary, who told them he'd only just gotten home from work and hadn't seen Jessie. And the kitchen made it even stranger. There were unopened grocery bags sitting out, like Jessie had just gotten back from the store, and then walked right back out without even putting the groceries away. From there, Jessie's sister called the older boy's grandmother on his father's side, since she regularly helped with both kids. The family hoped maybe Jessie had dropped them off there, but she said Jessie had been there earlier that day, then drove Jessie and the boys back home. And after that, she hadn't heard from Jessie either. Around 10 p.m., Jessie's mom tried calling the boy's grandmother, but she didn't answer. So Jessie's mom drove over to her house with Gary. The first thing she noticed was the grandmother's car. It was parked in a weird way, like someone had pulled in fast and didn't really care where it landed. They knocked, but no one came to the door, even though Jessie's mom could tell someone was definitely inside. She kept knocking, then started shouting that she'd call the police if they didn't open up. Only then did the grandmother finally come to the door. Inside, Jessie's mom found both kids, but Jessie wasn't there. The grandmother claimed she'd dropped Jessie off at home a few hours earlier, and they decided to keep the boys with her because Jessie couldn't handle the younger one, who'd been throwing a tantrum. Jessie's family didn't buy it for a second. They couldn't wrap their heads around Jessie leaving her kids behind, especially when her older son had just had a procedure and needed care. Jesse's mom also told police this wasn't the first time they'd clashed with the grandmother, Vonda Smith. In their eyes, she was way too involved in the boys' lives. The family appreciated the help. She watched them a lot, but Vonda could also get controlling, like she wanted to run the show. And just days before Jesse vanished, there'd been another blowup. Jesse had asked Vonda to watch the kids that weekend. Vonda agreed, but then Jesse suddenly canceled at the last minute. According to her family, Vonda was furious. Investigators decided to speak with her and showed up at Vonda's house around 2 a.m. First, they told her Jesse was dead, and her reaction fell off. Instead of breaking down, Vonda stayed oddly calm. She just asked, almost flatly, "Is she really dead?" And then immediately added, "I haven't seen her." Only after that did detectives ask when she'd last seen Jesse, and Vonda's timeline didn't match what Jesse's mother had been told. According to Vonda, Jesse showed up at the hospital where Vonda worked at around 1 p.m. Jesse asked if she could watch the boys because the younger one was acting up, and she couldn't calm him down. Vonda agreed, left work early, and the two of them, with the kids, went to a supermarket to grab some groceries. After that, Vonda said she drove Jesse and the boys to Jesse's house, where they dropped the bags off inside. Then they all went back to Vonda's place. Vonda claimed she gave Jesse about $1,000 because Jesse was struggling financially and had bills to pay. On top of that, she loaned Jesse her car and she drove off. Vonda said that around 6:30 that evening, she noticed a white van pull up outside her house. She looked out the window and saw her own car sitting there again, and a man getting out of it, then climbing into the van and leaving. She told detectives that, in the moment, she thought the man might have been Gary, Jesse's fiancé, but she couldn't say that for sure. Vonda also said that she never actually saw Jesse during that moment. Detectives asked if they could take a look at her car, and she agreed. But then she added something weird. She warned them the inside smelled strongly like cat urine because her sister's cat had messed on one of the seats a few days earlier. She said she'd tried to scrub the interior with bleach, but the smell still wouldn't go away. As soon as investigators started checking the inside of the car, they spotted multiple reddish stains that looked like blood, mostly on the front passenger seat. They also noticed smudges on the window next to it, like someone had recently tried to wipe it down. Crime scene techs collected samples and sent them to the lab, and experts later confirmed the stains were Jesse's blood. That process took a few weeks, and during that time, detectives questioned Vonda over and over, and little by little, cracks started showing. At first, she insisted she hadn't seen Jesse that evening, but later, she changed her story and said she actually saw Jesse get into the white van. Other details shifted too, and it was starting to feel like her timeline wasn't just messy, it was being rewritten. Detectives also pulled messages between Vonda and Jesse, and those texts backed up something Jesse's family had been saying from the start. Vonda was furious when Jesse canceled the plan to leave the kids with her for the weekend. By this point, investigators were seriously considering that Vonda was directly involved, and they laid out what they believed happened. In their view, Vonda wanted as much time with the children as possible, and she didn't take it well when Jesse pushed back. She may have seen it as disrespect, or even ingratitude, especially because she'd been helping Jesse constantly. Not only was she watching both boys regularly, including the child who wasn't even her biological grandchild, but she also seemed to be giving Jesse large amounts of money. Some of that was backed up by surveillance footage from the supermarket they visited that day. Vonda paid for all the groceries, and according to Vonda herself, she gave Jesse another $1,000 afterward to help cover bills. Detectives believed Jesse canceling that weekend visit was what finally pushed things over the edge. In their view, Vonda snapped. An argument escalated fast, and Jesse was killed. After that, they think Vonda moved the body, ditched Jesse's belongings, and then tried to clean the car out after using it to transport her. But even bleach couldn't erase everything. In the end, detectives decided to arrest Vonda, and she was charged with a double murder because Jesse was pregnant at the time she died. Jesse's family also believed Vonda was the most likely suspect, but Her defense attorney immediately started pointing out some major inconsistencies. First, they questioned whether Vonda could have physically pulled it off at all. She was only about 4 feet 10 inches, and she had serious health issues that limited what she could do. Jesse, after all, didn't die from one quick blow. The medical examiner said it was a series of brutal hits to the head, something the defense argued Vonda simply wasn't capable of. On top of that, Jesse's body had a lot of scrapes and scratches, suggesting a prolonged struggle. No one had formally examined Vonda for similar injuries, but detectives said that in the early days of the investigation, they didn't notice bruises or scratches on her. The defense also pointed to surveillance footage from the store, showing Vonda and Jesse calmly shopping together just a few hours before the murder. To the attorney, that didn't match the idea that Vonda was so enraged she snapped and killed her. And then there was the money. Vonda claimed she gave Jesse $1,000 that day, but that cash was never found with Jesse's belongings or near her body. What's more, police discovered Jesse wasn't actually behind on any bills at the time, even though she supposedly told Vonda she was struggling to pay them. Soon, Vonda's attorney found 2 witnesses whose statements cast even more doubt on the detective's theory. 2 separate neighbors said they saw Jesse near her home at around 5 p.m. What's more, they both noticed a white van parked out front, and one of them even said they watched Jesse get into it. According to them, there were 2 men inside the van, but neither neighbor could make out their faces. Police followed up on that lead and discovered that on the very same day, Gary's father, who lived in the same house as Gary and Jesse, had spent a lot of time with a friend who owned a white van. When detectives interviewed the 2 men, they admitted they'd been running errands in that van for most of the day, and they backed each other up with alibis. Gary's father initially claimed they'd stopped by his house sometime between 4:30 and 5 p.m., but later he walked that back and said it was probably closer to 3 p.m. Investigators also learned that Gary's father had a lengthy criminal record, and that he was currently facing charges involving drugs and weapons. On top of that, Vonda's attorneys insisted they had proof she'd cleaned her car before the murder ever happened. He said that around 7 p.m., Vonda drove to a friend's house because the friend had asked her to watch her granddaughter. That friend later told investigators she didn't see any blood in the car where her granddaughter got in, and she said if she had, she never would have let the child ride in it. The granddaughter said the same thing. During the entire drive, she didn't notice a single stain. On top of that, Vonda's friend said they even talked about the seat that had been ruined by the cat. Vonda's sister backed that up too. She confirmed they'd been discussing it days before Jesse died. But there was one catch. When Vonda's friend put her granddaughter in the car, the front passenger seat was covered with a towel, supposedly so the cat smell wouldn't soak into anyone's clothes. And that was the exact seat where investigators later found the most blood, even though there were traces elsewhere in the car too. The idea that there couldn't have been blood in the car at that point didn't sit right with anyone, because all of this was happening only about half an hour before Jesse's body was found. In other words, if that car had been used to move her, there should have been blood in it, and those stains couldn't have just appeared later. And the most conflicting evidence was still ahead. For months, lab analysts tested sample after sample from Jesse's body, and what they found only made the case messier. Under Jesse's fingernails, they recovered 3 separate DNA samples, all belonging to unknown males. The samples were too small to build full profiles, but there was still enough there to compare them against the men closest to the case. Investigators collected DNA from Jesse's fiancée, his father, the friend with the white van, her ex, and even Vonda's husband, and every single one of them was ruled out. Another male DNA sample was found on the torn-up pieces of Jesse's driver's license, but again, the lab couldn't match it to anyone. On some of Jesse's other belongings, they found female DNA as well, but it didn't match Vonda or any of the other women in Jesse's close circle. On top of that, 2 fingerprints were recovered from Jesse's shattered phone case, and neither of them belonged to anyone investigators had looked at. But the strangest discovery was on Jesse's underwear. Lab tests found 2 separate semen samples. One matched Jesse's fiancé, Gary. The second one belonged to an unidentified male. And to this day, they still haven't been able to pin down who it came from. So, by this point, the defense had built a pretty solid list of reasons to doubt Vonda's involvement. But prosecutors came back with something much harder to brush off. They brought in a bloodstain pattern expert. After examining the inside of the car, the expert concluded that Jessie had been transported in the front passenger seat, from wherever she was killed to the creek where her body was later found. The placement of the stains lined up with Jessie's body in a way that was almost impossible to explain any other way. And there was another key detail. The blood collected from those stains was mixed with bleach. That meant someone tried to clean the seat after Jessie's body had been there, not days earlier. If Vonda had only used bleach because of the cat smell earlier that week, the tests wouldn't have come back like that. The experts' conclusions suggested something even darker. Vonda really did scrub that car with bleach on the day Jessie was killed, which directly contradicted what she'd been telling investigators. And that towel on the passenger seat may not have been about a cat at all. It could have been there to hide bloodstains and damp upholstery. The trial began in 2018, 2 years after Jessie was killed. By then, both sides had built up a long list of arguments, some pointing to Vonda's involvement, and others suggesting she might have been innocent. Even with all that time, though, investigators still didn't have answers to the biggest questions: where Jessie was actually killed, and what happened to the weapon used to beat her. Still, the jury found Vonda guilty on 2 counts: first-degree murder for Jessie's death, and second-degree murder because Jessie was pregnant. She was sentenced to life in prison, plus another 25 years, to be served concurrently. Throughout the entire trial, Vonda never said a word. She didn't testify, and she didn't speak in her own defense. After the conviction, a well-known attorney who often takes on questionable cases got interested in her file. He believed Vonda may have been covering for the real killer. In his view, the prosecutor's evidence showed one thing for sure: her car was used to transport Jessie's body. But there still wasn't solid proof that Vonda herself took part in the actual murder. And then, another detail came out. Early on, detectives tried to track Jessie's phone, and the last signal they picked up was near the area where some of her belongings were later found. But the original document with that information was lost, and Vonda's defense didn't learn about it until almost the start of trial, when it was basically too late to make use of it. In 2020, Vonda's appeal was heard, but the court upheld her conviction. And only after that ruling did something new come out. Vonda had suddenly changed her story, but only in conversations with her new attorneys. Up until then, she'd always said she saw a white van outside her house, and that she thought the person in it might have been Jessie's fiancé, Gary. But Gary had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. He was at work. Now, Vonda claimed it wasn't Gary at all. She said it was William, her own son, and the father of Jessie's first child. She didn't give any extra details beyond that, and as of today, Vonda is still serving her sentence. In 2025, she filed a motion asking for a new trial or for her conviction to be overturned, but there's been no decision yet, and it's not clear whether her attorney submitted any new evidence that could actually move the court. Later on, Vonda's husband and William both said they had no idea why she changed her statement and suddenly claimed she'd seen William in that white van. During the original investigation, police never found a real reason to suspect William. He and Jessie had split up before their son was even born, more than 3 years before the murder. Still, in theory, you can point to a couple of possible motives, but none of them are backed by anything solid, legally speaking. One idea is custody. In court, it came up that Gary didn't want William involved in the kids' lives, and some people have suggested William might have been afraid he'd lose access to his son, and that fear is what pushed him to do something unthinkable. Another possible motive is financial. Maybe he was worried that Jessie would take him to court for child support. Or maybe he resented the fact that his mother was constantly giving Jesse large amounts of money. So basically, the theory is that Vonda may have helped her son cover this up, and that William was the real killer. But none of those ideas were ever backed up by solid evidence. Over all these years, William was never officially treated as a suspect, and from an official standpoint, his involvement isn't being pursued. Officially, the only person held responsible for Jesse's death is Vonda, and nothing about that has changed since the verdict. The only way this case moves in any real direction is if Vonda comes forward with something concrete, and without supporting evidence, it could all remain just words. It's also worth noting that even now, a lot of Vonda's friends and relatives still believe she had nothing to do with the murder, and they flat out refuse to accept that she could have done something like this. Megan Newborough was born in August 1997 in a small British town called Nuneaton, not far from Birmingham. She grew up in a big, close-knit family. She had an older sister and a younger brother. When she was just 2, her parents signed her up for dance classes, and from that point on, dancing became one of the biggest parts of her life. She also adored animals, and she was always begging her parents to let her have pets like hamsters, dogs, and even rabbits. Megan had a tight group of friends from an early age, and they all said the same thing about her. She was genuinely kind, knew how to show up for people when things got tough, and she had this way of really understanding what someone else was going through. After school, she studied at a local college, then landed a job in HR at a large brick manufacturing company. She settled in quickly, won over her coworkers, and started making plans for the future. The summer of 2021 was a big moment for her. Megan was 23, and she'd already managed to buy her first place. She was supposed to get the keys just a few days before her birthday, and she couldn't wait to move in with her dog. Until then, she was still living with her parents in her hometown. On August 6th, at around 7:30 in the evening, she told her mom she was going out to meet someone for a walk, got into her car, and drove off. Her parents expected her back within a couple of hours, but by 9:30 she still wasn't home. They texted her, then tried calling, but Megan didn't answer. She wasn't responding on social media either, and they started to worry. Still, Megan was almost 24 and very independent, so they decided to wait until morning. They figured she might have stayed over at someone's place or gone somewhere with friends, but she never got in touch, and by morning, her parents decided to call the police. Megan's older sister told officers that the night before, Megan had been planning to meet up with her boyfriend, a 30-year-old man named Ross. They'd met at work a few years earlier, but they'd only started dating recently. Her sister said Megan described him as kind, caring, and a genuinely decent guy, and that the relationship was going great. Police went to speak with him, while other officers started tracking Megan's car using an automatic license plate reader system. They quickly saw that at 9:30 p.m., about 2 hours after she'd left home, her car had been spotted on camera in a nearby town, roughly a 40-minute drive away. But that still didn't answer the big question. Why hadn't she come home? When officers arrived at Ross's house in Colville, they found his parents there, but Ross himself wasn't home. His mom and dad said he'd gone to a nearby town to visit a local bar, so officers called him. Ross told them Megan had come over to his place the night before and stayed for about an hour while his parents were out. Then he said she headed home, telling him she was going to stop at McDonald's on the way for a milkshake. Ross also said he'd been trying to reach her all day, but she wasn't responding. According to him, he'd texted her a few times the night before and got nothing back. He assumed she'd made it home and fallen asleep, but when she still hadn't replied the next day, he kept messaging her. Given that police had called Ross while they were literally standing inside his house, and his parents agreed to let them look around, officers decided to do a quick walkthrough and see if anything fell off. When they stepped into the living room, they saw it was a mess. There was stuff scattered across the floor, and a large damp stain soaking into the carpet. Ross's parents said he'd spilled coffee there, but they admitted they hadn't actually seen it happen, since they hadn't been home the night before. As they moved further in, officers spotted red stains along the baseboard in the hallway that looked like blood, so they called in forensic techs to collect samples and send them to the lab. Soon enough, the results came back. The red marks on the baseboard were Megan's blood. So later that night, police returned to Ross's parents' house and arrested him on suspicion of kidnapping. Ross stayed oddly calm. He even asked if he could put on socks before they took him to the station. As they were cuffing him, one officer asked straight up where Megan was. Ross barely whispered, "Can we talk about this at the station?" But the officer pushed back. Even a whispered answer would do. He could tell Ross didn't want his parents to hear, so he kept his tone friendly, trying not to scare off what sounded like a possible confession. Ross leaned in and murmured, "She's in Woodhouse Eaves." It was a tiny village near the same town where he'd been sitting in a bar earlier that day. Then, he got more specific and named a rural road just outside the village. The officer then asked if she was okay, but Ross quietly said, "No." He also added one more thing. Ross said he'd been planning to call police himself the next morning. While detectives drove Ross to the station, their colleagues headed straight to the area he'd named, searching the road with canine units. It was already the middle of the night, and the stretch of road ran for miles, but they weren't about to waste a second. Before long, they also called in a helicopter, and the crew started scanning from above, trying to spot Megan. Not long after that, officers noticed a small patch of flattened grass a few yards off the road near a low stone wall, so they walked over to take a closer look. When one of them shined a flashlight over the wall, he saw a woman's body. Part of her clothing was missing, and there were clean injuries around her neck. They immediately knew it was Megan. Medical examiners later came to a chilling conclusion. Megan died from strangulation, and only after she was already dead did the killer stab her in the neck 14 times. Meanwhile, police located Megan's car. It had been abandoned in the parking lot of a college in a nearby town. Forensics found Megan's blood on the front passenger seat, and nearby they recovered a glove that contained Ross's DNA. On top of that, investigators requested location data from Megan's phone and learned something else. Since the night she vanished, it had been sitting in a field not far from Ross's home. And because the phone was still on when it was left there, the data was precise enough for officers to go right to it and find it in the grass. When they examined the phone, they also found Megan's messages with Ross. The text showed that on the night she disappeared, she indeed drove to his house. After the murder, Ross started messaging her and leaving voice messages, acting like he was worried she wasn't responding. The next day, with Megan's body already lying out in that field, he kept texting her, pretending he had no idea where she'd gone. By lining those messages up with the car's movements on surveillance cameras, police were able to piece together what happened in the hours after the murder. Ross, who didn't have his own car or even a driver's license, had been driving Megan's car around the area with her body sitting in the front passenger seat, dumping evidence along the way. That trail led investigators to security footage near a fitness center. It showed Ross pulling into the lot, getting out, and tossing various items into a trash can. One camera even caught him changing clothes right there by the car, stuffing what he'd been wearing into a bag and throwing that bag in the bin too. After that, he didn't get back into the car at all. He just left it there, then took a taxi home. Police immediately collected everything from those trash containers, and inside, they found blood-stained clothing belonging to Megan, rags with blood on them, her glasses, and Ross's own clothes as well. At that point, investigators had a pretty solid working timeline. Megan likely arrived at his place around 9 p.m., and about 40 minutes later, he strangled her, then stabbed her in the neck over and over, and started trying to cover his tracks. But there was still one key piece missing: motive. That changed pretty quickly. Even before detectives sat Ross down for a formal interview, they went back through his earlier messages with Megan. In those texts, Ross admitted he struggled with erectile dysfunction, and he said he blamed it on the ADHD medication he had to take. Megan didn't pull away from him. Instead, she told him she'd support him. A few weeks later, Ross started talking about wanting to try being intimate with her, but based on their messages, it didn't work. And after that, his texts started getting more and more angry and aggressive, while Megan kept trying to calm him down and reassure him. Detectives also searched his computer, and that only added to the pile of evidence. At around 11 p.m., basically right after he got home from dumping Megan's body, Ross Googled, "How to tell a girl you love her." Minutes later, he left Megan a voice message saying he was worried and didn't understand why she wasn't answering. Then things took an even darker turn. Right after recording that message, Ross started looking up articles about 3 well-known killers. He opened multiple pages about Levi Belfield, who murdered at least 3 women, then read about Ian Huntley, responsible for 2 murders, and after that, he pulled up several articles about Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. After that, his phone and computer went quiet until the next morning, but at around 6:30 a.m., he was back at it, searching articles about serial killers again, while also visiting an adult site and watching videos focused on violence and humiliation. When he was done, he texted Megan, "Morning, babe." Not long after that, he started Googling the safest prisons in Britain, who cuts inmates' hair, and other questions about what life in prison is like. So, in a short window of time, investigators had built a pretty overwhelming picture of what Ross had been doing and what likely happened to Megan. But they still needed to interview him, and the story he told didn't match the narrative detectives had worked out. From the beginning, Ross didn't deny killing her. He admitted it, but he claimed it happened during an argument and that he lost control. He said he strangled Megan, then went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her in the neck over and over. As for what set him off, Ross gave detectives his explanation. He said that years earlier he'd been abused and that it had affected him ever since. That night, when they tried to be intimate, he claimed it triggered flashbacks of that trauma, and he snapped. He also told them that at the start of that breakdown, he'd managed to pull away from Megan, but that she tried to comfort him and came closer. That's when, he said, he attacked and killed her. Still, investigators didn't buy some crucial parts of Ross's story. To them, it looked like he was trying to steer this toward a manslaughter, something with a much lighter sentence. What they believed actually set him off was much simpler. He couldn't have sex with her again. Detectives learned that not long before the murder, Ross had ordered erectile dysfunction pills online. He was likely hoping they'd fix the problem, but it still didn't work. And in the investigators' eyes, that mix of anger and embarrassment is what pushed him over the edge. Ross also admitted Megan was one of the very few people he'd ever told about his condition. Investigators thought he may have been terrified she'd tell someone else, even though, by all accounts, Megan had only ever been supportive and understanding. And then there were Ross's searches right after the killing. Detectives believed he had an unhealthy obsession with serial killers, sexual depravity, and violence, and that he wasn't just panicking after the murder. He was indulging something. In their view, he got real gratification from the idea of committing a brutal crime, and with his impotence issues, that may have been the only thing that made him feel in control. Finally, investigators pointed to how hard he tried to cover it up, and the fact that he only admitted to killing Megan after he was arrested. He didn't just dump her body and get rid of evidence. He also kept texting her, trying to make it look like he had no idea where she'd gone. He just didn't think through the basics. Ross likely didn't expect to be caught on multiple security cameras tossing bloodstained items and driving Megan's car around. He also didn't think to power off her phone before he ditched it in a field, which is exactly why police were able to locate it. And he probably didn't realize detectives could pull his browser history and see the serial killer searches and the violent adult content he'd been watching. But despite all of that, Ross kept pushing the same line. It wasn't a premeditated murder. It was a loss of control. So, the case went to court. Ross's lawyer tried to convince the jury that it all came down to an uncontrollable burst of rage, triggered by Ross's past trauma, along with his struggles with depression and anxiety. He even went into the trauma in detail, saying Ross had been abused by a man named Stephen Bidman, who in 2016 was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before parole for a different crime. Bidman and a friend had kidnapped and killed a young woman, but he didn't spend long behind bars and later died of a heart attack. The case became one of the most infamous in the UK, and it's been covered in several major documentaries. Still, none of that convinced the jury that Ross was being truthful, and the prosecution's version of events felt far more solid to them. The trial wrapped up in December 2022, and it took the jury just an hour and a half to reach a verdict. Ross was found guilty of murder and was given a life sentence, with the chance of parole no earlier than 23 years. Not long after sentencing, the Attorney General's office asked the court to increase Ross's minimum term. They argued that, in their view, the crime had a sexualized element, given Ross's fixation on serial killers and violent adult materials. But the Court of Appeal rejected that request, saying there wasn't convincing evidence of a sexual motive or sexual context in what happened. So the sentence stayed the same, and Ross could be eligible for release when he's in his early 50s. It's also worth noting that during the trial, Ross repeatedly broke down in tears, but Megan's family didn't believe it was genuine. In their eyes, he never showed real remorse and kept clinging to his own version of the story. After Megan's death, her parents founded a nonprofit in her memory. The goal is to support initiatives that protect women from violence, and they also donate part of the money to a dog welfare charity because Megan absolutely loved dogs. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.